welcome the commissioners and the public, and welcome to our new guest from TV Land, which we'll address later. The first order of business would be to adopt the proposed agenda. Do I hear a motion to that effect?
So moved.
I do. Rebecca? And I hear a second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. Unanimous. The approval of the minutes of September 26, 2013 and October 11, 2013. We can either take those up together or individually.
Can we take them up individually, please?
Sure. All right, let's do the minutes of September 26, 2013. Are there any objections or corrections to those minutes?
There's a correction in the audit committee report. Last sentence, or second to last sentence, should missing a will. We'll be discussing your report.
What page would that be on now?
Page 2.
Page 2, it's just a grammatical thing where it got left out.
Red page 2?
No, sorry.
Red page 4.
No, page
Red
four.
page 4.
Red page
Yeah, red page
4.
four.
Are you talking about third line from the bottom?
Mhm.
Yeah, of the audit committee.
Yeah.
Comma, and would be discussing the report?
And will be?
Correct. Will or would, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Didn't say would.
Any other?
I have one, I'm not sure exactly how to handle this. On 8, Section 8, Mr. Loftus stated the valuation comprised of $20 million to SCRS, 5.2 to local government investment pool. It was actually the state general deposit portfolio. I don't know if I could correct it there, correct it now, whatever your decision.
Where is it? What?
Middle of the paragraph, I say local government investment pool, and I should have said state general deposit portfolio. I'm not sure that too many people are concerned about that.
Is that on red page 8? Or-
No, that's.
Is that red page 13?
13.
Any objection to that correction? All right, anything else? Hearing nothing else, we'll vote on whether to approve the minutes as amended in those two respects. Do I hear a motion?
So moved.
Second? I'll
Second.
Okay. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I'll abstain from voting on the minutes as a new member,
Since you weren't there.
since I was not there.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome. Those are the first words you've spoken as a member. Now, the minutes of the other meeting, the date of which escapes me,
October 11th?
October 11th. Do I hear any motions with respect to the October 11 minutes? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Well, are we gonna have discussion? Because on these minutes, I was waiting for kind of discussion before we went straight to a vote on the approval, because, you know, we do the summary minute format, but there was certain elements of the conversation that I think are important, that I'd rather have a more complete transcript on both the questions asked and legal's response to it, for the record. I mean, that would kind of be my request. So personally, I would like to see these minutes carried over and provide it in a little bit more detail.
Tell me what you mean now.
Well, like, for example, there's several, you know, as it relates to me, is Mr. Gillespie asked a question. It doesn't say what that question was, but a lot of those questions were directed at legal and received a legal response, and so I just think there needs to be a more complete transcript.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, and where is that?
I'll give you an example. It's a couple of places. Responding to a question from Mr. Gillespie, that would be red, page 16.
Okay.
Last paragraph, bottom page.
Mhm. just kind of that section of the, where we're asking questions of legal and legal's responding. I just think there needs to be a more complete transcript.
Okay, so starting with that paragraph on red page 16, and then continuing on through the first two lines on page 17, would you like to have something closer to an actual transcript of those,
Yes.
of that?
Yeah, I
portion
think
of
if
the
we can take another, more detail,
Okay.
there. So if we can take another, my request be that we carry these minutes over and take another crack at them.
meeting? Okay.
I second that.
That makes sense to me, but what the crack at it you would like is
Is something closer to.
Closer to
Well,
a
if they're gonna get in there and
transcript, that's it.
transcribe it, why don't we just transcribe the whole thing?
There is a transcript. They
I
transcribe.
know, but I mean for the minutes. I mean, if
I
you're-
agree.
If
Yeah.
you're, I mean, I don't know if you're gonna transcribe a portion of it, I don't know why you don't just transcribe the whole thing.
I agree.
Well, some of this, well, I know we've
At
talked
least
about
that
this
whole
before,
section.
but, well, historically, we've always used summary minutes,
Right.
because the minutes have become the official record, right? We haven't done a full
No, and I'm fine with-
transcription.
I'm fine with
right?
generally doing that, but if we're gonna transcribe a portion of it, I think that's gonna be hard to pick it up and put it in there in context without just doing the whole thing. At least the whole section.
We have a transcript. We can attach the transcript. I think we should.
One thing we've always been able to do is just take the transcript and let the minutes always just be summary minutes, which always makes sense to me. And just, for the minutes themselves, just have the motions made and the actions taken on the motion. If y'all would like to, if the body would like to discuss that, making that general change to our minute format,
No, sir.
this would be a good time for it.
That's not correct. Whatever we vote on becomes the actual minutes of the meeting.
And what we vote on becomes the resolution of the meeting, not the minutes of the meeting.
No. Mr. Chairman?
Are you talking about whatever we vote on when we vote on the minutes?
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct. You're correct. I stand correct.
Mr. Chairman, the quote transcripts that we usually get are more like detailed notes. I have found errors in them here and there. That would be one of the issues. No offense. That would be one of the problems that I would see with adopting the full transcript, and also some of them could be 300 pages, 300 pages long. What we've often done is, like, for instance, with Mr. Gillespie's request, and we have done this in the past, is when you wanted more detail, then we've gone back to the tapes and whatever notes we had, which would include the transcripts, and we would add more detail and circulate that and see if that was sufficient.
The meeting itself, we take out the executive session, was not very long. I think we should just do the whole, I think we should provide the transcript for the whole meeting, and we also have an audio of it. Just attach the audio. I don't think it has to be in writing. This is going to be a subject will be the subject of litigation. We ought to have official minutes, and they ought to accurately reflect what was said.
No, I mean,
Why would we do anything else? I
We will
mean,
make every effort to make sure that the minutes do accurately reflect. And I thought that Ms. Schilly proposed a decent solution for addressing the request. I would hope that we could continue to pursue solutions like that,
Okay.
revising the minutes.
The motion on the floor is simply to carry these minutes forward, so let's carry them forward.
Mr. Chairman,
You'll take a stab at.
let me
Yes.
just ask a question. If we're going to, and I didn't hear, Nancy, what you said, but if we're going to continue with the summary minutes, okay, and in addition have the transcript, if there's other areas that need to be changed, okay, we really ought to address that so that we aren't continually, Robert, you don't continually go back in, but if there's other issues that you have, Commissioner, I think it would be appropriate to bring those up this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm generally fine with the idea of summary minutes, but I think when the commission is receiving legal advice, I do think it rises to a separate, I think there just needs to be a more detailed record than a summary when it becomes the official record and you're receiving legal.
My question to you is, if there's other issues in the summary minutes
Right.
that need to be addressed by Robert, it would help us that we do it all at once.
Right. No,
If any other
it's
commissioners-
really just where, you know, Robert or legal's being asked a legal question and we're getting, you know, advice back from legal. I just think that
Okay.
needs to be, you know, the more detailed piece of minutes.
Very good.
And I'd
Okay,
like-
so that it'll be carried over, another set of minutes will be presented, and then next time, if it comes up, if that's unsatisfactory, let's have some specific recommendations on exactly what to change. And then we can move on. So these are, there's a motion and a second that the consideration of the October 11 minutes be carried forward. Is there any more further discussion? All in
Well,
favor?
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
is it possible to circulate the minutes amongst the commissioners so that we can get feedback, so that next time that comes up for the vote, it's not fresh
It's-
on our
yeah,
eyes
it's-
again?
as soon, I was going to ask them, as soon as the changes have been made, go ahead and circulate.
Okay.
That's a good idea.
Give us plenty of time to think about it. Any further discussion? All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. Any nays? Ayes have it unanimous. Okay, let's proceed to the agenda. I guess that's on page 1. I'm up next. Sarah, what's the status of the issuance of the audited financial statements by FEMA?
Certainly, PIVA has issued the audited financial statements, and they have received a clean opinion from Clifton Larson Allen. That's correct.
That's correct.
And that gets incorporated into our annual report? Is that, which is
It gets
incorporated?
incorporated into PIVA's CAPR, and we make sure that that's reconciled with our annual report.
Okay. The next item, I would like to announce and get the committee ratification of the appointment of Rebecca Gunlinson to the Compensation Committee. As you recall, when I made the committee appointments last, or when the commission adopted the committee appointments last, we've had 2 commissioner changes since then. Ms. Gunlinson has come on, and Dr. Wilder has come on. And I said I'd readjust them once we had a permanent set of commissioners. I was on the compensation committee, and I said I would take myself off because I think the chairman has plenty to do and doesn't need to be on the compensation committee. So I'm recommending that Rebecca Gunlinson replace me on the compensation committee. And that requires, by the governance policy, that requires ratification by the full commission. Is there any objection to that?
Do we need 2? Because that's showing that Dr. Pritchett was on there too. Do we need 2 appointments?
Ron Wild, yes.
I mean, oh, yeah,
And Dr.
yeah, that's
Wilder?
true.
Yeah.
And Dr. Wilder. And I had announced then that I thought at least while I'm the chairman, that I would always want to appoint the retiree representative as the 3rd member of the committee. So I'm asking for ratification of both of those appointments, Dr. Wilder and Rebecca Gunn. So the new compensation would be Ron Wilder, Rebecca Gunn, and Ed Giobbe. And it being a 3-person committee, they can select their own chairman.
What's the theory behind having a retiree member always on there?
It's their money. It's being paid out of salaries, and I think they should have a vote in.
It
The reasonable-
It should be on every committee. I mean,
Well,
the salaries are the smallest thing we pay. Yeah, I don't,
that's my thinking, and the same thinking I announced when I said it before. That's my recommendation.
Well, it's all the retirees' money, and we paid $402 million, and they're not on that committee, so, in fees. So we put them on the committee where it's the smallest amount of money, as if it's special, and it's not. It's false reasoning. I'm more than happy to have you there, you do a fine job, I just. one of
Well,
those-
Mr. Loftus, there is no committee that sets the fees. The commission as a whole determines the appropriateness of the fees. The commission as a whole votes on every single contract we enter into that calls for fees. So that argument doesn't hold water. Any further discussion? All in favor of ratifying the appointments of Ron Wilder, Rebecca Gunlinson, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Ayes have it. Unanimous.
And I abstain.
So was
You don't have to abstain from that
Yeah,
one.
yeah, the motion was adopted.
You were here for
Who made
this
the
one.
motion? The chairman made the motion?
Chairman made the motion.
Yeah.
And was there a second?
Well, chairman made the announcement. It's a ratification thing. I
Okay.
don't know that that
Well,
calls for a
Commission
motion.
ratifying.
Right.
Okay, report of the audit committee. Alan?
All right, so audit committee's met a couple of times. I guess we've been meeting probably monthly. You know, the first item, you know, there's some updating to the audit committee charter. Dory, do you want to, who's going to speak on that? Where's Andrew? What's kind of the order here? I can't see many people in here.
I don't think it was passed out.
At the request of the audit committee, we made some changes to the audit committee charter. There were two types of changes. The first one was more to align the charter with the updated governance procedures, which Dory, the policy, the governance policy overall, and Dory made those changes to that. The other change was to more readily clarify the meaning of management letters, to make sure that, because we also deal with managers from an investment standpoint, the committee wanted to clarify what purview they were looking at when we talked about management letters. So those are the two types of changes that occurred in the committee charter.
So that was one item. Who's presenting the others? Andrew?
For policy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Did you want to make a motion on the charter?
Oh, yeah, so I would like, well, do we need the motion? I'm trying to remember.
Mhm.
Oh,
They
yeah.
need to
They need to-
approve.
they need to approve.
Okay, so we need the commission, a motion to approve the amendments to the audit committee charter. Audit committee obviously is, you know, recommending that these changes be accepted.
It's the audit committee motion.
Alan, I've read those amendments.
Mhm.
Can you summarize them, or they seem to be technical in nature? Was there anything substantive in there?
No, I mean, the only, yeah, I wouldn't call it substantive, but clarification on management reps, because, you know, with the issue with the official statements coming from PIBA, right, we had asked CIO and management here to provide a management rep letter. At the same time, we received management representation letters from private equity funds and other managers. So the biggest was to clarify, when we referred to management letters, which letter was being referred to, right, or letters were being referred to. And the others, I would say, were more technical changes.
The others were all technical. They were updating for legislation, saying there's 7 members of the commission rather than 6, and referring to our COO as the COO instead of the director of all
Right.
sites authorities.
And is that a motion of the committee?
It is.
Okay. Is there any further discussion, questions? All in favor of the amendment to the audit committee charter, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. Ayes have it.
All right, now for audit committee, turn it over to Andrew.
I'm going to give a quick overview of some employee compliance policies that we have recently completed. These compliance policies are to provide greater guidance to RSIC staff regarding the following topics: code of ethics acknowledgement, whistleblower policy, conflict of interest and receipts of gift policy, and personal trading policy. The development of these policies was a group effort, including external legal counsel, which was hired to assist RSIC staff with the policy development. Counsel from the State Ethics Commission was consulted regarding state ethics applicability, and the audit committee has reviewed the policies, met with external legal counsel, and provided input on the compliance policies. This slide covers the compliance policy format. This is the general format for the policies. Obviously, not every policy is going to follow this, but wherever possible, we follow this format. The general format is a purpose statement, the statutory framework, which ensures that we cover Title IX and the State Ethics Act where applicable. We reference the specific statutes and penalties for violations. Then we also include monitoring efforts performed at RSIC, procedures if applicable, and additional guidance if applicable. I'm now going to go over a high-level overview of each of the policies I referenced. I'm not going to read these slides word for word because they are part of the material. I'll just touch on, I think what we see as the most important portion. In regards to the Code of Ethics acknowledgement, this one-page acknowledgement serves as a consolidated process by which RSIC employees will annually attest that they have read and will comply with laws and policies related to ethical standards established by RSIC and may be updated from time to time. And new employees would sign this upon hire. The next policy is the whistleblower policy. This policy provides important guidance for RSIC employees in regards to whistleblowing. As all RSIC employees are statutorily exempt from the South Carolina Whistleblower Act. The next policy is the conflict of interest and receipt of gift policy. This policy sets forth guidance for dealing with potential and actual conflicts of interest for all RSIC staff. The fundamental principles underlying this policy is that RSIC staff are in a special position of trust and confidence, and they must studiously and conscientiously avoid not only actual conflicts of interest, but all reasonable appearances of conflict of interest. While this policy is intended to provide guidance for RSIC employees, it does not supplant or supersede applicable law or other policies approved by RSIC. This policy should serve as a guide, but application of the policy is dependent on specific situations and relative facts. And the last policy is the personal trading policy. This policy is designed to prevent and detect violations of regulatory and other legal requirements related to personal trading by employees, and enables RSIC to protect employees from inadvertent violation of these requirements, safeguard against the fact or appearance of employees profiting from knowledge gained through their position at RSIC, and demonstrate that RSIC has reasonable and effective controls in place to ensure compliance with legal requirements. Next steps. Implementation will include notification and training to all existing RSIC staff, and on a go-forward basis on an annual basis. All new RSIC staff will be required to sign the Code of Ethics acknowledgement during his or her orientation process. This acknowledgement also certifies that you have read all the other policies that I mentioned and will adhere to them. Internal audit will attest to the compliance policies as determined by the results of the internal audit annual risk assessment. And the last is we could assist the commission with related policy developments as appropriate. As I noted early on, these policies only apply to RSIC employees. The governance policy does develop a compliance framework for commissioners, but if the commission is interested in having similar policies, we will gladly assist them and take input from the commissioners. Okay?
Yeah, so audit committee, reviewed the policies, and Monica, and Andrew will be working now that, as the policies are implemented, an audit plan, and reports back up to test compliance with the policies on a go-forward basis. So, we feel good that, these are now, been drafted, going to be circulated, trained. So audit committee's happy with the results and the progress on this front.
And what's the adoption process for this one?
Some of that is, left to the discretion of management. Obviously, it's something you want to have in place because there's an annual routine, but because these haven't been in place, so my expectation I would hope management would have plans implemented kind of by the early part of next year.
Has management adopted them, or is management going to be adopted? That's what I don't know.
The training's forthcoming and the adoption will be forthcoming.
Okay.
We just met on this last Thursday, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or Wednesday, whatever day that was. Other issues audit committee looked at, which are also in the policy pack, the fee reports, the reconciliation back to the as it relates to fees and accounting. And I will say, you know, it's the perspective of the audit committee that we, on fees, got a full accounting that I'm confident to say I'd be hard pressed to think there's another state that has a more full and complete accounting, and a lot of people's efforts. You know, we mentioned at the audit committee, a lot of effort. I don't know who all is involved, if all those 6 people or 7 people, you know, everybody we recognize at the audit committee. If y'all just stand up for a minute, I want to recognize y'all. You know, people, you know, across, you know, both on PIBA side, our side, you know, a lot of different bodies involved in that. And so, you know, I know the question related to financial statements and other stuff, but I think we definitely have the most transparent fee reporting in the country as it relates to fees. So the audit committee went over that report. I'm trying to think what else got presented. I'm working off forgot my cheat sheet this morning.
Most of the other items were executive session items.
Right. That's the audit committee report unless there are questions.
Any questions? Hearing none, thank you for the report. I had skipped over part of my chairman's remarks, mainly because I was waiting for Commissioner Joby to get here. So I would, let me return to a portion of that. Can I get staff to distribute this resolution, the final draft of which was done sometime overnight? I just got it when I walked in this morning, but basically it's a resolution. While they're distributing, I'll summarize it. It's a resolution thanking Dr. Travis Pritchett for his service on the commission virtually from the inception, and appropriately recognizing him, and it would be presented to him at an appropriate public occasion. But let me just pass it out and ask everybody to be looking at it.
You want to just carry it over till March?
And what I'm thinking about doing is y'all look at it, and if I'm assuming it's that there are minimal typos and would be ready for adoption, but maybe if we can just carry it over to right before the lunch break to actually consider it. If anybody in the interim has some suggestions they'd like to make, pass notes to the who's the final author of this? Is it you, Nancy?
I think it's
Yeah.
Joint-
Anyway,
joint effort.
pass it over for any suggestions you'd like to make about changing it, and then we can move on to the rest of our agenda items. I wanted to announce that one of my staff people too had gotten a very nice award, but I don't have in my notes the actual name of the award. Danny, could you hand me something that would show me exactly what he got? And I'll come back to that. And finally, there's one matter I'd like for the commission to be aware of, and let's see what action should be taken, if any. But on October 28th, the Spartanburg Herald Journal reported that the treasurer had received a gift in the form of iPads and gift cards from an unnamed investment firm. I've asked Commissioner Loftus to inform the commission of the identity of that investment firm, and I'd like to renew that question this morning. Mr. Loftus, you're free to communicate with either the attorneys or our compliance department. I don't care who on the commission, but I strongly urge you to do so in the full name of transparency and accountability.
Sir,
Is it an investment firm that we're likely to do
In the full name of
investment?
transparency, I'll be more than happy to, Mr. I'll give you the files, I'll give you everything you'd like. You sent me an email, I think, yesterday. So I don't know that I had really time to get prepared for this, and it wasn't on the agenda. It's just another little present from you. But thank you very much, and then I'll provide you with all the information you want.
What is the investment firm?
I'm not gonna talk about it now. I don't have the files in front of me.
Okay.
You know, excuse me, do we have the rules where we have to have substantial issues on here 24 hours a day before we come in here? Don't we have an extranet that we load information to? Why is it that I'm always asked questions that I don't have an opportunity to accurately prepare for?
Well, I got a newspaper
please show me the
report, I got a
respect.
newspaper
Yeah,
report.
Yeah, okay.
Day
Please show me
before
the
yesterday,
respect
and I
and give me a little
emailed you
time
immediately.
Please show me a little respect, and give me a little time to get the information from the files so that I don't misspeak. Thank you, sir.
So you do not remember the name of the
Well,
investor?
I remember.
Point of order, where are we on the agenda?
It's not,
In the
it's made
chairman's
up
report.
again. Anything not to talk about $420 million of fees. That's what this is all about. So go right ahead, Mr.
Commissioner Joby, I don't know if you got here, when I passed out a resolution for Dr. Pritchett, be looking at that during the meeting and then turn it back in. We're gonna bring it up for a vote, a little bit out of order at the, right before lunchtime. Okay. I-20 will do that. All right, we'll move to the next item on the agenda, the COO report.
Mr.
I'd like
Chair.
to introduce to the public our new Chief Operating Officer. I don't think he doesn't need me to go into his background and experience and all of that, but I will just acknowledge to the public and to the people in TV land that Greg Ryberg is our Chief Operating Officer, and this is his first commission meeting. Welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, members of the RSIC staff, members of the treasurer's staff, all other interested parties to include the press, and anybody here that just came to be on ETV today, I wish you a good morning. Let me start by, first of all, thanking James Manning, our Investment Commission Staff Director of Technology, for his work with SCETV to enable us to be fully transparent in this commission meeting. It was really interesting to me to observe the entrepreneurial negotiations between two state agencies to deliver this much-needed service. Also, I don't believe many of you realize that James serves on the Richland 2 School Board. And James, I want to thank you for your work here and your civic involvement to make South Carolina a better place. I also wish to recognize 150,000 retirees for their involvement in the operation and accountability of the Investment Commission. We all work for their benefit and the benefit of the additional 233,000 working members of the retirement system. The trust fund is their money, all of them. I trust that we will keep this in mind today and every day. Let me now give you my observations and expectations of the Investment Commission and my task ahead. Many of you may know that I come to this position with what would be considered a very deep background on this issue. In the mid-90s, the treasurer had the opportunity only to invest in bonds and in treasury notes. That evolved in the early 2000s, and I like to say that I authored and co-authored every piece of legislation dealing with this investment commission, going back to its creation in 2005. I also authored or co-authored in 2012 the recent major legislation concerning the retirement system, including the creation of the Public Employee Benefits Authority, which is a trustee of this fund that the Investment Commission invests. I had and I have a strong passion for this subject, which for too long was a can kick down the road. I have an intimate knowledge of the issues surrounding the South Carolina Retirement System Investment Commission and of the sentiments of decision makers in South Carolina relative to those entities. One of those sentiments that I'm compelled to point out is Code Section 9-1-1310, Section A of the South Carolina Code, that provides that, and I quote, The Retirement System Investment Commission shall invest and reinvest the funds of the retirement system. End of quote. The General Assembly created the commission as a whole to be the sole investment authority. No provision or authority exists for any lone public official to veto or amend an investment decision of this commission. The General Assembly also provided that the commissioners, with one exception, be qualified individuals. That is, that they have some sort of work experience or education that would inform them of just what is going on here. The point of that was to take the politics out of the investments of the participants' money. I can tell you that the legislative intent on all sides of the aisle was that the investment of money should know no party nor no politics. The one individual that's able to serve without those qualifications, of course, is the treasurer of the state of South Carolina. It is the case that the holder of that office may appoint someone with those qualifications, just like the other members of the Budget and Control Board, but that is not mandatory. Now, my understanding is that there may be some confusion as to why the General Assembly decided to leave the possibility open for that seat to be held by a person without the otherwise necessary qualifications. The reason was very simple. The General Assembly at the time held then Treasurer Grady Patterson in the highest regard. Mr. Patterson had been the state treasurer since 1966 with only one 4-year hiatus. And Mr. Patterson, as state treasurer, had been the manager of the investments of the trust fund for all of those years. Those of you that knew him, he was a gentleman of serious and calm demeanor. And he had proven himself over 7 decades of service as honest and trustworthy. Mr. Patterson, as you all know, was a Democrat. He was very, very highly respected by both parties of the General Assembly. He was a decorated war hero, and he was qualified. For those reasons, I had no qualms at that time. The General Assembly simply failed to anticipate in the statute that Mr. Patterson someday would be gone. The General Assembly, nonetheless, as noted in Section 9-1-1310A of the South Carolina Code, was clear about the fact that each individual, regardless of whether or not they hold one of those qualifications, simply serves as a voting member of the commission, nothing more and nothing less. Each individual is one of 6 votes, period. An assertion to the contrary actually contradicts the law. I tell you this as a person who was there when it was written and when it was voted into law, nearly unanimously by both Republicans and Democrats. I know what the law says and why it says it, and I will perform my duties at the Investment Commission accordingly. Those who want to operate differently will do so only following a decision by the courts. I am pleased to have finished nearly 6 weeks as a Chief Operating Officer at the Investment Commission. I'm also pleased to report that the atmosphere in our office has been calm and steady. Our staff is working hard and functioning like I think you would envision any investment office of this size. In a recent discussion with an agency director, he stated to me that if he were to list the 10 assignments that he wouldn't take, my job at the Investment Commission would be on that list. To me, that was true irony. Because in retirement, if I had established my own bucket list of potential jobs, then this one would be my number one pick, period. I truly regret the decisions that led to my arrival here. I'm committed to moving forward. I operate in the present with an eye to the future. My commitment to y'all includes my intention to address potential problems and issues early and straightforwardly, and to arrive at solutions quickly. This office is a business office and not a political office. And as such, it must enjoy proper decorum, mutual respect, and stability to function properly. To date, in my dealings with the Investment Commission, I have found them to be honest, competent, hardworking, and totally committed to maxing our investment return within the risk profile that is consistent with the annual investment plan. I am truly proud to have the opportunity to work with such fine, dedicated public servants. And I believe they will continue to succeed on behalf of the retirees and employees covered by the South Carolina retirement system. I have not discovered any evidence of assertions made by others, including altered financial statements, waste of state assets, inadequate internal controls, violation of state security laws, nor have I found anything relative to ethics issues involving conflicts of interest. I've looked closely for evidence of the last charge concerning ethics, and I have found absolutely none. I have not found, and I quote, a hidden world that no one knows anything about, end of quote. I have not found true the accusation that the commission misleads, and I quote, the commission misleads the public at every turn, or that, and I quote, is deceitful. I've not found anyone here, not one, that is, and I quote, dishonorable, or that and I quote, lacks a moral core. There is an excellent, excellent moral core at this investment commission that has been unjustly belittled and demeaned. As I am certain you are aware, this has had an adverse effect on our team's morale. I've reviewed previous commission meetings not only through the videos but through the minutes. And it appears that the meetings very easily can be made more efficient and effective. Very often allegations are made that at a very minimum are misleading, and upon further review are discovered to be untrue. In addition, there are topics that are mentioned as an aside, but that deserve more attention than a soundbite or a non-productive argument. The statement from the September meeting that a discovery was made of, and I quote, previously unreported, end of quote, $1 billion loss is a prime example. That statement was not supported by any evidence at the time, but it certainly qualified as political red meat for the cameras. I learned in my previous life as a politician of 20-plus years that sometimes the truth doesn't get in the way of a good soundbite. But responsible adults handling $27 billion of someone else's retirement money cannot operate in that fashion. I suggest going forward that such non-agenda items be identified by the chairman to be noted in the minutes as a pending question. Upon conclusion of the meeting, all pending questions will be listed and sent to all the commissioners. Staff will then provide the relevant facts to address the question, and those will be included with the finalized minutes. This, of course, is at the discretion of you, Mr. Chairman. It is only a suggestion on my part, but it may help us to avoid lengthy distractions during the scheduled business of a commission meeting. I was privileged to own and operate my own business for 22 years, and I was honored to employ over 500 wonderful individuals. I always felt that my employees, whether they were 5 or 500, worked with me and not for me. My policy towards employees will be exactly the same here as it was in my business. I will demand respect and congeniality, and I cannot allow hostility, intimidations, or threats from anybody, especially management. Efforts to control or blame investment commission employees or to be intolerant of their views likewise will not be allowed. My hope is that such situations never will arise, but I believe that my record on these issues is clear. The investment commission employees will work in a safe environment. Again, my intention is that the investment commission be about the business of maximizing our investments return within the risk profile which is consistent with the annual investment plan. It has been my experience thus far that investment commission staff also has this as their number one priority. This fact is a tribute to those commissioners who have hired and developed the administration and staff despite the politics through which you've had to navigate. Our ultimate bosses, the over 370,000 South Carolinian retirees and employees, deserve no less. This is my sole focus, and it is shared by Investment Commission staff. I will not allow that focus to be diverted. I have noted that some press accounts have cast my hiring as a prelude or indeed an invitation to some sort of combat. From my standpoint, nothing could be further from the truth. I have said, and I will say again, that I came here to work for the over 370,000 participants in the South Carolina retirement system. Retirees and active employees, such as you see depicted on this screen. I am working to keep the smiles on their faces, and combat is not going to achieve that. On November the 5th, I attempted to begin my tenure on the right foot by sending a letter to Commissioner Loftus that contains many of these sentiments. I welcome him in this letter to, and I quote, visit my office at any time going forward to inform me of his concerns, complaints, or grievances, end of quote. I said that to continue, and I quote, I will listen and will act in accordance with what is best for the Investment Commission. I've had no reply to that communication, and I can only conclude that all is well. My belief is that differences of opinions need not be personal. It need and can be constructive. This was quite evident when we in the General Assembly developed the Investment Commission, and when we later adopted revised benefits that were consistent with our ability to fund them. Constructive differences in the South Carolina General Assembly were resolved through dialogue and not through an uninterested intermediary such as the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. I've been asked about my work schedule. And my reply is that I work for you 24/7. When I had the honor of serving in the South Carolina Senate, my home phone number was always listed. And my personal cell phone number was, and still is, on my home answering machine. Whether I'm in the commission office or in the senator or house member's office I'm never out of reach by phone or by email. And I know that those who have contacted me have found me responsive. This is not a part-time job for me. I cannot work part-time and repair what the Inspector General calls in his report and I quote, increasingly toxic workplace that undermines, and I quote, RSIC's energy and focus on its core mission. I want to repeat that what the Inspector General said about these offices. He called it an increasingly, and I quote, increasingly toxic workplace. I've told you and I believe that such an atmosphere is not the result of any of your staff in this office. Too much damage has been done for me to give this job anything less than my full-time attention and my full-time effort. I fully understand the job ahead and all its components. I will not stop until that job is finished, and I will not allow distractions to further undermine the good people here and the work that they do on behalf of the employees and the retirees of South Carolina. Those familiar with my tenure in business and in the South Carolina Senate know that I don't seek confrontation. However, backing away when confronted, especially with petty half-truths, non-truths, and non-constructive matters, is not an option for me. The senators that I served with know that the one attribute that I brought into my elected office in 1992, and the one that I left with in 2012, was my integrity. I did not allow that to be questioned then, and will not allow it to be questioned now. I appreciate truly the people who work here. I appreciate the stakeholders with whom I've met and whose concerns I have heard. I appreciate those who have entrusted me to the task of preventing further harm to the trust fund and indeed setting the commission on a positive path. I truly hope that everyone in this room shares that goal. We have limited time, and I have no time for those that don't. I want to close with a couple of items. The Commission voted for a budget proposal that seeks to add additional FTEs in the coming year. This staff request not only seeks to establish the proper personnel level for an investment office with our particular mission, but also it's to reduce the amount of fees that we pay to external managers for the same service. I'm optimistic about the reception that we might receive from the General Assembly. Earlier today, Andrew Chernick discussed management policies regarding conflicts of interest, personal training, and other topics concerning internal ethics and ethical conduct. I'm pleased with Andrew and Compliance's, Monica's work, and the Audit Committee's work to reduce our practices into written form. Reducing present practices to writing in no way suggests that any conduct other than strictly ethical conduct now occurs here at the Retirement System Investment Commission. Also, I want to tell you that there will be a draft strategic plan for the Retirement System Investment Commission that will be coming to you soon via email. I hope that, Mr. Chairman, you'll want to discuss it at the February meeting. It is our hope. We're certainly asking for your thoughts and your comments prior to that time. I appreciate the opportunity to work for the state of South Carolina, the retirees of South Carolina. My goal is to help you keep smiles on the face of retirees and employees of South Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you. following up on your comments about the staff. I'm going to exercise chairman's prerogative and return to something I started that did not finish during the chairman's remarks. Brian Moore, is Brian in the room? He was earlier. Brian, stand up. Brian moved down here from Pennsylvania, I believe it was.
Yes.
And he immediately wanted to get integrated into Columbia, and he looked around for a civic organization to join, and he and his fiance, still fiance?
We're getting married on December 20th.
Okay. He and his still fiance joined the West Columbia JCs, and I just want to commend him for being typical of an investment commission employee who wants to be part of this community, wants to help the community, and in recognition of that, he's been named South Carolina's Outstanding Young American in the category of business, economic, and entrepreneurial accomplishments. And he'll be a candidate for, and I think probably a leading candidate to receive a national award in that connection. And I'm really pleased that they chose him in those three areas, because business, economic, and entrepreneurial accomplishments are what we're all about here, and the entrepreneurial attitude that has infused this commission from day one is something I'm very proud of and remain proud of. And I'm proud of you, Brian, and proud of the staff that you represent so well. Thank you. And now, Mr. Chief Investment Officer.
Are we going to have an opportunity, because COO mentioned something that I think was a good point in regards to pending questions, right? I mean, how did we memorialize those in the minutes? Should we write them down? Because that was one of the things I even noticed last night going through the materials. I don't necessarily think we need to use meeting time, but there are questions.
I hadn't
from
heard
time.
that recommendation before. As he made it, what I thought I would do is at the end of today's meeting, I would say, I wrote down here pending questions,
Right.
and I'm going to make a bullet point note of them. If you want to raise one now, or if you want to
No,
wait till the
I
end
mean,
of
mine
the
can
meeting.
wait till
Okay.
later, but, I think it's a good recommendation.
I think that's a good recommendation.
Right, but I just procedurally want to say, how do we go about it? Right?
I figured we would develop the pending questions during the course of the meeting, and then at the end, we can kind of wrap them up to the extent they haven't been answered. We'll know which ones are still pending. That's my intention. Okay? We'll move on.
Thank you, Mr.
Tim.
Chairman. My remarks today are, I'll cover a few items for the commission, and then as always, we'll have a performance update, both from the staff side as well as consultant USNS Knopf. One of the things that had come up from the September meeting, I believe, and even in the audit committee at that point in time, was some questions about the Russell relationship and the overlay program. So a little bit later today, we actually have Greg Norquist from Russell here to give a presentation along with staff to hopefully address and give the background and some historical context for everyone with respect to that program itself, and answer any questions that you may have as well. My comments are really in two categories. One, just brief manager updates, and then also with respect to some of the asset allocation and the transition from the 630 policy going into the new fiscal year policy, and what some of those transition points are. With respect to managers, there was an approval in September for Industry Ventures, and that approval was for $40 million investment into their, what I'll refer to as their core fund, and then a $40 million investment into their co-investment fund. We advised the commission that we weren't sure if we're going to get any or full capacity of that $40 million to the co-investment fund, and the update is our capacity that we received is 0. So as it stands right now in discussions with Industry Ventures, there's a potential for a slightly modified version of what that co-investment strategy would be. Staff will continue to investigate that, and if we find that it's of credence and fits with the overall investment parameters that we have, we'll bring that recommendation back to the commission. But the update is the total of 80, 40 for the main fund, 40 for the co-investment fund. It's only 40 for what I said was core fund, of their main fund, their main strategy, and 0 for the co-investment fund at this point. If that changes, again, we'll let the commission know. With respect to Strategos, they were an asset-backed securities manager, a specialty manager for that space. And the commission had authorized the CIO to make modifications to that account, if you will, or actually move away and fully redeem from that strategy. And we're in the process of doing that, and we expect the final redemption to come in at the end of this month, of November as well. So that account will be effectively down to zero. That's important because that in itself was a credit allocation, which ties back into an overweight beyond the maximum target in credit for the transition. So that was one step in reducing that overweight of the maximum weight, if you will. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. The other update I have will be with respect to securities lending. And if you'll recall, there was approximately $165 million of total losses in the collateral pool. I think it was 3 years ago now, we actually hired the specialty manager, Strategos, to manage the asset-backed security piece of that. Upon the transition of those assets, there was a difference of cost versus market. That difference was approximately $75 million for that. That was paid at that time from the trust assets to transfer and offset that loss. So a total of $165 million minus 75 gets you back to the 90. With the proceeds from the settlement that came back to the trust fund of some $20 million, that too was used to offset that $90 million. So that gets you down to 70. When the issues that happened with the collateral pool investments and the parameters there, what we started doing is actually mapping the revenue from securities lending into a reserve account. That his cumulative value was approximately $20 million, and we are now in the process of using that to further offset those losses. Once that's complete, which I believe will be done possibly even next week, that loss then will be at $50 million. So that's approximately where we will be with the collateral pool. Those losses will have to be made up if that pool is terminated or we select a different agent. So that's one of the things that we'll have to notify the commission of, is the timing of when that will have to be made whole. With that said, I've been in communication with our consultant for us to take a look at securities lending options and to actually make a full presentation back to the commission in February. So I think there are several things to understand there. One, securities lending programs as a whole, do you want to continue with these? And if you do, what's the structuring and who could be some potential providers for those services? So we'll bring that back in February. The asset allocation, as we've transitioned from the prior fiscal year's targeted policy weights, and then we changed the maximum and the minimums. As you go into 7-1, you can't obviously instantaneously change your asset allocation. So there's this transition period that we've talked about. And so I want to give you an update as to where we're at there. There was about a 2.5% overweight to the maximum weight for the mixed credit, and the mixed credit is structured products, high yield, and bank loans. We are effectively right there at the maximum right now today as we stand here in November through several redemptions, one of which is Strategos that we've talked about. The other is through redemption from the Lunacells Long-Short Credit Fund. Now that we still have exposure there, but we have reduced that allocation overall. So we're back at the maximum there. We'll continue to make modifications to the credit piece of the program to get closer to the target weight. With respect to the overall hedge fund allocation, we were at the beginning of this fiscal year at approximately 18% allocation. The target for the low volatility was 8%, but a maximum plan wide of 15%. So we've been in the process that we talked about. I think the number I previously mentioned was somewhere around the 800 and 900 million of redemptions to get back to that 15% maximum cap. And we have put in a set of redemptions, some of which we are actually getting cash back and have gotten cash back here in the first quarter of the fiscal year or third quarter of the calendar year, and some that we'll get back for 12/31 and then March 31st of the next year. That will bring us back just under that 15% maximum, and we're going to continue to make some changes there as well within the overall hedge fund portfolio to bring us back closer to the 8%. So that's the update from the transition perspective. With respect to the February meeting, as we're talking about asset allocation, here in just a few short months, we'll find ourselves having that discussion again with an update from Hewitt on what the asset allocation recommendation should be, and as those changes will affect the SIOP and then the annual plan. So that's all coming up in February as well. And then, of course, the AIP needs to be approved by, delivered before April 1st of the fiscal year, and then approved by May 1st of the fiscal year. So we'll be in a good position to have that done because we'll have an April meeting. So those are my comments. And if there are any questions, I'll turn it over to Mr. Phillips to give the performance update.
I did have a couple. From last month when we, September, I guess it was, when we did the index funds, I wasn't sure where the money was coming from. I mean, I know it's coming from different places. Where's the bulk of it? Just liquidation of the physical assets? Or?
That's a portion of it. And then if we take a look at the overall cash that we have currently on the balance sheet that's being overlaid, there's some $6.5 billion, but about $6 billion is being overlaid. So as we use that cash to actually fund up the index managers, the overlay will come down.
And last month when I asked you about the Russell, and I have a little chart here, did you feel threatened in any way that I'd asked about this report?
About the Russell report?
Yeah, I was listening to the comments there. Did somehow, because it's, you just mentioned it, did you feel threatened that I asked about Russell, and now you've got the man from Russell here, and I was just trying to find out, because he just spoke about it. And,
I didn't hear anybody say threatened, I'm sorry.
oh, just part of it.
The Russell comments came up
Yeah.
from the audit committee discussion, and then there's inquiries from your office with respect to that as well, and some of your staff members were there, so I'm guessing they'd informed you. My thought is that it makes a lot of sense that, staff has been responsive, but I think the best way to handle it as well is actually get the people here who are actually implementing it,
Yeah.
so that there are more questions. So that's why we've asked Russell to be here.
No, I agree. It was just the COO speech. Let me just say, 'cause I don't want to get into it, but it's the most political speech I've ever heard. It's a work of fiction, and that you can get away with it in this room shows you the problem.
That's
It's
out of
just-
order.
it's just a pure distortion.
You're out of order, that's not an
And
agenda
that
topic.
makes
It's
my
not
point
responsive to
about
the
the
CIO
lack of a
report.
moral core right
Well,
there.
I will make one comment. I back Mr. Ryberg 150%, and everything he said is accurate. I respect his experience, his...
And so that's not out of order, Mr.
Please
Chairman?
don't interrupt me.
That's-
When I'm speaking, I expect you to stay quiet and listen to what I have to say, just as I listen to what you have to say. I will continue. I said I respect Mr. Ryberg for the job that he's doing, he has done, his experience, his unqualified dedication to public service. I think we are extraordinarily fortunate to have him in this position, and I will certainly be behind him unqualifiedly.
Mr. Phillips?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll be speaking today on the performance for the fiscal year-to-date, 3 months ending in September 30th this year, which is our first fiscal quarter. So starting with slide 2 here, as usual, we start with some perspectives on recent market performance. Asset classes here are ranked in descending order in the red box for the fiscal year-to-date period. All markets are positive, so that's a good starting point. Equity-based markets are at the top. Fixed income and credit markets are at the bottom. The U.S. and the EFA were driven by continued economic recoveries, albeit at different stages in the cycles for the regions. Emerging market performance was primarily driven by China. Comparing the 3-month period to the first 9 months of the calendar year, the additional observation that I'd make is, or that I note, is a positive turn in commodities from, if you look at the negative 8.6% for the 9 months to the positive number for the 3 months, and then the emerging market debt from 7.1% in the 9-month period. So both of these categories were negative for us at our last report. Slide 3, turning to the plan. Plan returned 4.33% in the quarter, 40 basis points ahead of the policy benchmark. As we look down through the asset classes, all categories added to the plan, another positive note. Equities and real estate are at the high end. I would mention that we will return to the cash and overlay number here at the end, and go into a little bit more detail on that line. The emerging market debt and short duration fixed income were at the bottom, but again, we're still positive. Back to the emerging market debt and commodities categories. Emerging market debt here for the plan, coinciding with the market turn. Emerging market debt went from negative 8.5 to a positive 0.2 for the period, and commodities from a negative 10.4% to the 3-month period of a positive 0.7%. And just a market observation, fixed income and credit for both the benchmark and plan numbers. For either or both the short end of the yield curve or higher credit rating categories, these categories generally continue to offer very low return prospects. Slide 4 is portfolio exposures relative to our policy targets, some of which Herschel spoke to a few minutes ago. The plan is most significantly overweight in the hedge fund low beta category with a difference of plus 2.6% in that category, and mixed credit with a difference of plus 4.3%. Per Herschel's comments, these are the primary areas in transition from our last policy targets. With respect to cash and short duration category, the 22% shown here is approximately $6.1 billion, split almost evenly between cash and actual short duration securities. And as a reminder to Treasurer Loftus' question, a portion of this cash is earmarked to fund the global equity mandates approved in September. Slide 5, investment performance added $1.2 billion to the plan for the quarter, and a more granular allocation of that P&L, of that profit, is presented here on slide 6. So a couple of points from this chart. Again, all asset classes were net positive. That is not to say that all investments in our portfolio were positive for the quarter, but on a net basis, it does roll up to a nice positive contribution across the chart. The global equity assets produced a significant, although disproportionate, positive contribution. And you will notice on this chart something new. We have broken out the contribution of the overlay activity, which is the checkered green and orange. The orange is almost negligible. It's most prominent here in the global equity and GTAA categories on the top of the right side of the chart. I hope everybody can see that okay. So let me. So the overlay portion of global equity is this 315 on the top. The overlay portion of GTAA is the 52 here. There's an orange negative contribution in this category right here. You can barely see it. And then in commodities, there's the commodity swaps and the $13 million contribution there.
Mr. Phillips, I want to thank you for this chart. My inappropriate question from last chart month must have prompted this. It was very helpful. It let us do significant work at the office over the last last few days, and I appreciate that.
You're quite welcome. We've done a lot of work internally to break this out. We have more to come.
Thanks.
I think we take some responsibility for a lot of responsibility. I take personal responsibility for not doing as good a job on presenting this as I possibly could have in the past. So that will continue to improve. So just picking up here, roughly half of the profit allocation in the GTAA category and global equity categories, as you noted from the chart, came from the overlay exposures. Almost all of the commodity profit allocation was swap-based, and it's in the $13 million checkered box that I mentioned. And the EM debt contribution from the overlay allocation to that category was actually negative at the negative $1 million, and that's the orange one that you can barely see. Slide 7, as usual, we compare our asset class actual experience to the strategy benchmarks. I'll note here, because it will be difficult to reconcile this with some of the previous numbers in the last slide, this does exclude the cash and overlay line from the plan performance table we presented earlier on slide 3. Therefore, it does not reflect the overlay contribution. Stated differently, this is the plan's performance from our physical allocations. It's worth reiterating, everything here is positive for the quarter, plan and benchmarks. In terms of which asset classes were most meaningful, global public equity is at 30% allocation. We experienced outperformance relative to the benchmark in the U.S. and non-U.S. international markets, developed markets, and underperformance in the emerging markets equity category. So that's more detail within this one bar for global equity. The GTAA and private equity bars combined for 20% allocation of the fund, so another significant two buckets. Positive contribution from both, but GTAA is lagging on a relative basis. That bar, back to the remark I made on physical allocations, this bar, the dark blue bar, is Bridgewater and GMO contribution to the fund. The hedge fund low beta and mixed credit categories combined for just under 20%. So you'll see hedge fund low beta here and mixed credit right next to it. These two performance numbers are 20% allocation of the fund, 15 to 16% of which is in hedge funds. And that's, again, what Herschel mentioned too, some of which is in transition. Good results on both of those, on both absolute and relative basis. Slide 8, focusing on the extremes of the relative performance. So just as a reminder, this is the difference in the individual bars on the previous chart. So if we just focus on the extremes here, just to highlight, just to hit the high points, the private debt category, the first one, this is the total plan. So this is the 4.33, 40 basis points above the benchmark in this bar. Most extreme outperformance is in the private debt. As I look through that category, we had 21 allocations in the private debt category. Only one of those actually returned a negative number for the quarter. Only 4 of the 21 had a less than 1% return during the period. The range was actually 2 to 6% across those categories. So as you look at the very extreme outperformance, which is also evident here, private debt here, as you look at the difference in this category, two things to note. We had very good performance in our allocations, and the benchmark is actually very low. So you end up with a very large relative bar here. On the other side of the chart, the GTAA negative relative performance. And my guess here is that this is actually a kind of a basis risk aspect. The benchmark is high here with the performance roughly 50-50 equity component and a world government bond index. So the equity component, the MSCI World Index, returned 8.18% for the quarter versus a bond index of 2.9% for the quarter. So you get a very strong index on a combined basis. The benchmark's fixed income component is, in addition to the performance, it actually is composed of nominal bonds. We do have a significant allocation to Bridgewater here, and the composition of that portfolio is inflation-linked bonds. There's a basis mismatch there to some extent. In addition, I would note too that this is actually not as bad as it looks. However you interpret bad here, it's negative. But this actually, again, does not include our synthetic exposure. As you recall, earlier in the year, we replaced Putnam with synthetic exposure. The synthetic overlay component of the GTAA actually outperformed the benchmark. So that would lessen the extremity of this negative number here. So switching to a short list of significant contributors, accounting for both size and performance, or allocation size and performance of the funds. This is public markets. Equities and hedge funds comprise most of the top 15 on the left side. If we shorten the list to the top 10, equities and GTAA categories are the top 10. Again, that's including GMO and Bridgewater All-Weather. On the right side, the Goldman Sachs Emerging Market Debt Fund is the only significant allocation with a negative performance for the period. It's the bottom, number 49 on the chart on the bottom right side. Otherwise, a few mixed observations on the right side of the table. Most significant allocations here have more muted numbers. So the largest allocations in the negative category have more muted performance numbers. They are still positive by and large. A very few good high performance numbers are notable on the right side as well. However, those are smaller allocations. There's one significant allocation with low but positive returns. So you'll note number 40, D. Shaw Composite Fund is a significant allocation at 1.15%, but the return there is 55 basis points. Again, still positive, but being a significant allocation, it ends up on the right side of the charts here. Overall, I guess I would note, again, I've done this in the past, but overall this is a very good report when our worst contributions here are still at or above zero. Sticking with public markets, this is our largest public markets allocations. We try to screen out for anything that's, or screen for, filter to anything that's greater than 1% allocation for the fund. This chart represents $12.8 billion in capital allocations, 47% of the plan. Contributed approximately 181 in aggregate, 181 basis points of the 4.33% for the quarter. All are positive, although some are just barely positive. Standouts here are Times Square, number 8, Pyramus Global, number 12, and Integrity, number 19, all have double-digit returns. And I would make one further highlight, primarily because I'm very proud of some of the internal work that we're starting to do here. Russell U.S. Large Cap, number 6, is actually an internal effort led by Managing Director Jeff Berg in conjunction with the Russell team. That is an optimized portfolio to replicate the S&P 500. It's tracking very well, slightly ahead of the S&P since inception and for this period presented. And we're very pleased with our initial efforts here. So let me stop here on public markets allocations, see if there's any questions before switching gears to private markets.
David, one question on emerging market debt. Is that primarily in local currencies, or is it dollar denominated, or if it is in local currencies, is it what's the hedging factor there?
The several answers to your question, Commissioner Giobbe. One is the benchmark is half and half, emerging local and U.S. dollar. The exposure that we have is also a mix. We try to not give up too much basis risk or tracking error risk there. I think the underperformance there is coming specifically from the Goldman Sachs allocation. And I don't recall off the top of my head, maybe someone could help me, the mix of local versus U.S. there in the Goldman Sachs fund.
Yeah, I believe the Goldman Sachs is actually closer to a 50-50 blend. And then the Mondrian account is more local. And then some of the ETFs have the local nature to them and U.S. dollar nature to them. So you do have a little tilt there. But more of this is actually not necessarily the beta component. It's a little bit more the alpha component or the active management component that's leading to the underperformance.
In terms of hedging, Commissioner Giobbe, we do not actively hedge local versus U.S. We leave that to the manager's discretion.
David, one other question on the cash and short duration. Is that something that you change from time to time in the current environment? Obviously, there's going to be some different weightings that you would attribute to both cash or short duration. And how do you manage that at the moment?
A couple answers there as well. There are policy targets for both of those categories. So within those policy targets, we manage primarily the cash bucket with respect to the obligations that we have to pay liabilities, plus our margin and collateral obligations in the overlay program, as well as cash within the strategic partnerships that's there to support those entities, if you will. So kind of a remainder then of what is left for cash in order to support the enhanced yield, as well as supporting the overlay program. The rest goes into the short duration bucket. So you have very highly liquid short duration securities plus cash actually supporting the overlay program. So multiple frameworks. I hope I didn't muddy it up too much for you, but there's a number of components that are bracketing those two pieces together.
And when you talk about short duration, David, how far out maturity-wise do you go?
It's a maximum of 3 years.
Is it
Maximum 3 years, right. And Jeff is here to go into more detail on that if you'd like for him to. Okay.
We were just pointing out that the duration's around 1 year of the aggregate portfolio.
So moving over to the same perspectives on private markets on slide 11 here. In the left box, 10 of the 15 of the holdings are in the plan's strategic partnerships. 4 of the 15 posted double-digit returns. Another separate 4 are greater than 1% allocations, also with very good returns. And just as a side note, as I noted, the strategic partnership allocations here and them being represented real well on the left side of the page here. We do have guests from Apollo, GSO, and Goldman Sachs here with us today. So it's fitting that they're well represented on the presentation. We thank them for their contribution to the plan. On the right side, 7 of the 15 actually posted negative returns, but the allocation sizes were in the 11 to 40 basis point range. So negative performance, but very small allocations. Overall, a similar note to the public markets observation I made earlier. We like to see our high conviction allocations meet the higher performance expectations that we attribute to them, and that's evident here in these tables again. Page 12 is the largest 20 private markets allocations. Capital represented here is 12% of the plan, or alternatively 63% of the private markets total allocation. This group of 20 contributed an estimated 44 basis points to the 4.33% for the quarter at the plan level. And we have a good mix of both direct allocations as well as strategic partner allocations and decisions on this chart. There's only 2 negative returns. One is a co-investment that we can discuss at a very high level if a commission wants to do that. The other is number 18, Warburg Pincus. As we checked on this particular line item, and these stand out because there are only two negatives on the chart. So we checked on this yesterday. It's actually a timing issue with a reporting cycle. So this fund is actually performed well during the calendar third quarter. So this one is misrepresented here with stale performance mark. Dave Klauka reviewed this in detail yesterday in case we want to go into a more timely update on this fund. But again, that one will catch up at our next report. So I'll pause here on private markets before moving on. Any questions here?
I have one question. Anytime that you mention quarterly returns, are those always reported as annualized?
No, sir. The quarterly returns are reported on a quarter basis. If it's more than 1 year, it will be an annualized number. If it's more than 12 months.
Thank you.
So moving on to slide 13, change of topics on you. Some new content here. We will start breaking out the overlay use as long as it's relevant to performance. We'd like to mention John Reichner, David King, and Josh Green did some very good heavy lifting work for us over the past couple of weeks, and we will continue to improve on what we do here. So as of September 30, we had $6.1 billion in synthetic market exposure. In the breakout to the right, 2/3 of that exposure was attributed to the global equity asset class, primarily in non-U.S. developed markets, EFA markets. We expect this again to come off or come down significantly as we fund allocations to the passive equity managers that were approved earlier this year. The GTAA component, again, sticking to the right side of the chart here, is a proxy. It replaced the Putnam allocation from earlier this year. Commodities is a third piece. It is the usual passive implementation versus the Dow Jones UBS Commodities Index, total return swaps. And then lastly, the EM debt is also a swap to a proxy of the benchmark, of our policy benchmark. Some more detail by asset class here. Global equity at the top. We have active managers in small cap and emerging markets categories. Try to point some of this out for you here. So the dark blue is a physical manager allocations. The green is the overlay or synthetic component of the total global equity exposure, market exposure. So here we have small cap, emerging markets, as well as the internal Russell U.S. large cap portfolio that I mentioned that Jeff Berg has headed up for us is all in this category. Synthetic portion of this is primarily futures contracts, and as you look at this 4.299 number here, you can drop down and see the composition of that in this bar. So the blue being futures synthetics positions versus the red is a swap position. So the major component of this is futures in the EFA markets. GTAA category second. Again, the physical is GMO and Bridgewater, all weather. The futures part, the synthetic part is a futures basket of equity and fixed income, again, optimized to model the benchmark, policy benchmark. Commodities is third, and as I mentioned, this is a Dow Jones UBS, actually a number of Dow Jones UBS total return swaps. It's actually 3 swaps, is totaling $530 million in the red here. And I'll take the opportunity here again to just mention some of our internal work. One of those swaps is a swap to the Roll Select Index, the Dow Jones Roll Select Index. And that was a result of a recommendation by our analyst, Justin Young, and it's adding value, and we're very pleased, again, to have impact from an internal decision here showing up in our portfolio. The last component, EM debt, emerging market debt, mentioned previously. The physical part is the blue, and that's primarily Goldman, Mondrian, so some of the other funds allocations we have there, and an ETF allocation in the blue. The synthetic is a swap, again, another proxy to the benchmark, roughly split equal between local and U.S. dollar-based exposure. And last, this is an estimate of the overlay performance on notional exposure. So we can contrast this with slide 3 earlier on with the cash-based or margin-based numbers that show up in that cash and overlay line on the performance report. This is $6.1 billion, which is roughly 22% of the plan's market exposure. The component this component of the portfolio added approximately 150 basis points to the plan during the period, so that you tease out from this number. So a lot of new information here. Let me stop there, see if there's any questions. I'll be happy to go back, time permitting and interest permitting, to talk about the cash and overlay line relative to some of the stuff in the back here. So let me stop.
So this is where the pending question part maybe comes in as it relates to the Russell. I know in terms of sort of the asset allocation, we're using, the UBS, as the benchmark and sort of the baseline. But I noticed when you look at sort of the capper information, so, hey, let me say this is good in much more detail than we've had in the past. There's a sole gold futures contract listed, right, which is clearly a component of that larger allocation, but it looks a little odd because it's the sole commodity futures position sort of listed in the report. So, and some of this relates back to, ultimately kind of, reporting back up, but I mean, that looks very much like an active decision and an active bet, right, on a particular commodity rather than the commodity index, right? Yeah, I don't know if that's because of rolls, but, and we pick this up later, but that, maybe a little more detail around that.
Sure. So the gold position itself is actually thinking about more of a balanced allocation because, some of the indices themselves tend to be heavily weighted to a single commodity or a set of commodities such as energy. And so the idea is to try to get a little bit more balance with respect to some of the things that would actually be much more either an inflation hedge or act like a currency for market drawdown type periods. So that was more of a trying to get a little more balance in there. That's why that was there.
In the index.
Commodities.
Right. Relative to the UBS.
Relative to the
because
index.
I
Right.
assume it's energy heavy.
It is.
Essentially, and you're looking for a flatter. Why wouldn't you then rebalance that across a broader basket of commodities versus just that one?
Well, it's where we're doing some work right now, and the whole idea is if you think about, a lot of people have commodities, there can be a growth aspect to it, and there can be this inflation hedging aspect to it. The subset of some 30, 33 commodities markets, there are about 6 or 7 that you really want for inflation hedging. And so we're actually going back through that. One of the primary ones is gold, and so that's why we've initially just done gold. But we're doing some work right now to take a look, is there a broader set of truly more inflation-sensitive type commodities that could act as more of a hedge there? I shouldn't say hedge, more of an exposure for if you get into an inflationary environment.
Wouldn't it also be fair to say that there's a trade-off between the complexity of that overlay and cost? So you don't want to create an overly complex overlay because of the cost elements to it as well?
So, and some of the smaller commodities, some liquidity there can be a little bit challenging to get to the size that we would want. So it's an area that, gosh, probably a year ago, I guess, we had talked about at the commission meeting about a better way to actually implement a commodities exposure through the core set of hedge funds and then more active satellites, if you will, to try to minimize some of the negative roll yield that you're going to experience. So getting that exposure versus the spot market, you tend to always lag by 200-300 basis points just because of the negative roll yield. So how can you overcome some of that? And that goes back to getting the different swap index, if you will, implemented there, plus looking at what are some of the other underlying commodities that could actually provide more direct exposure for compensating for a certain factor in the market, such as inflation. And so gold was the primary one. So, but we are taking a look at other pieces there. Copper would be one, some of the aluminum, some of the other metals as well.
Right. Yeah, I just bring it up just because, at a higher level, kind of back to sort of that reporting mechanism. I mean, I don't think anybody in the commission is certainly against staff, but obviously that's introducing a lot of, an active bet and or a basis risk, however you want to view it, relative to sort of the allocation benchmark, of kind of what we're expecting, which is fine. I just think there needs to be a clearer than an annual report where we see that. Right?
Any other questions?
If there are no further questions, I'm going to take a 5-minute break before we hear from HEK. We'll come to order. We have a full complement of commissioners. Let's come to order, and I'll recognize Suzanne Bernard. Is that correct? You're going to be doing it?
I'll be doing it this time.
For the HEK report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to introduce one of my colleagues that not all of you got a chance to meet, but he might pipe up during the meeting, so I thought it was important so you knew who he was before he says anything. This is Peter Cronus over here. Peter is part of the larger HEK team that works with you. We actually have about 20 people back at the shop that spend a meaningful chunk of their time working to help staff and the commissioners make this a successful program. So Peter works very closely with Brady and I, and Brady had a conflict today, so I thought it was a good opportunity to have him here. Also, he's very close to the data, so if we get into any data issues, I have him along for support and make me look a little smarter. So let me jump on in here. We have a larger performance report that we send out to you. This is the succinct version. And David's done a very nice job covering many of these topics, so I'm going to spend just a very small amount of time on the areas where we overlap. On the first page, we're just basically addressing what's been going on in the program from our standpoint, looking at the meaningful things that commissioners need to be paying attention to. One we've already addressed is that as we move from the old targets to the new targets, we were slightly out of compliance, but only in one asset class during the past quarter. And that was mixed credit, and by now we're actually very much on top of it. The other overriding element that we have is that maximum hedge fund allocation of 15% across asset classes. And that also was a little on the higher side, but actually is coming back into compliance as well. So it's very good progress to get meaningful change in asset allocation implemented from 6/30 till today. So we're happy with that. Overall, performance was good relative to your benchmark. We're going to talk about how it looks against peers in a couple of minutes. And I think the real, if you look back at the last really 3 years, and particularly this year, what we see as being the big driver was the stock market. And I'm not going to belabor this. Dave went into a very nice summary of it. But if you look at how the stock market's done the past year, it's been the place to be. So if we all looked at it with 20/20 hindsight, we would have been in Russell 2500 and earned almost 30% over the last year. But it's just not how you run a pension fund. So we want to make sure we've got a nice diversified exposure to all of these. But it's been an exceptional period, even going out to the 3 and 5 year periods and 10 year periods for the stock market. We're back to returns that are comfortably within the high single digits, as opposed to what we were seeing a couple quarters back when the 5 year returns were still very much impacted by the financial crisis. As you go down into the fixed income area, no question, fixed income has been a challenged area. We all know what's happening to interest rates. We're going to have some great discussions later today from industry experts on how they see the markets evolving over the next 3 to 5 years. But we certainly are in a rising interest rate environment from a long-term perspective, and that has obviously had an impact on the fixed income markets globally. Obviously, you're doing a lot of sophisticated things within the fixed income market to not have a large dedicated exposure to long-only fixed income and to provide some better protection to the fund. Commodities, we talked a little bit about. You can obviously, for the last year, that's been a very difficult area of the market. Hedge funds, real estate, private equity round out the last 3 categories. Asset allocation, we looked at this a lot of different ways. This is where you are versus your new policy targets, and you can see a lot of detail here, but as you go through it, you'll see that really the only area where we're out of the ranges was mixed credit. Performance over really all periods that we've been looking at, the year-to-date, which is this calendar year-to-date, not the fiscal year-to-date. Third quarter represents your fiscal year-to-date. The 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, the net of fee performance of the total fund is comfortably in excess of your policy benchmark, in excess by more than a percentage point annualized. So there's 2 really big concepts. If you break down management of a portfolio into 2 basic pieces, you have what's your asset allocation and then how do you implement that asset allocation. What this is trying to get at is the implementation of that asset allocation. And over the last 5 years, the commission and the staff have been very successful in doing that, adding quite a bit of value net of all cost. This goes through all of the various pieces. I think Dave did a very nice comprehensive evaluation of how each of these pieces break down against their respective benchmarks. There was one I wanted to comment about, and if you could look down about 2/3 down the page, down here on sure I'm at the right place. Private equity is where I was looking. I'm sorry, it's actually up here at the top. So private equity. We've got a custom benchmark here, and we'll be next quarter adding another page that goes through all that. We have it in our bigger performance report, but it's not always obvious what these are. Private equity, what we're using as a benchmark here, and what most plans use, is public equities plus a threshold. So here it's a combination of U.S. and non-U.S. stocks plus 300 basis points. And most public pension funds use that sort of a benchmark because they're trying to develop a proxy for how much additional return one should expect over the public markets to take private market illiquidity and risk. And 300 has usually been tossed out there.
One question, when you talk
Yes.
about your public equity benchmark plus 300, what do you use for the public equity benchmark?
It's a combination of U.S. and non-U.S.
Russell 3000 and MSCI.
80-20, correct?
80% Russell 3000.
Right. So 80% U.S., 20% non-U.S., and then we add a 300 basis point premium on top of that. And that's a very common approach. And what I want to point out is for the last year, if you look at that benchmark, you see that it was up 24% versus 19.4. So one might say, wow, our private equity hasn't done as well. I would just like to point out that I have yet to see a private equity program that's actually outperformed that benchmark for the past year. Because we've had such strong returns out of the public equities, short-term benchmarks aren't very useful in assessing their success. So I think it's longer term you need to look out. We've got the 3-year returns of the markets are pretty strong as well. We would expect over time that you should be earning at least 300 basis points in excess of that benchmark. The program itself has only been in place for around 5 years, so the fact that you're earning those sorts of returns is already impressive.
On using that, we have global equity as our public equity benchmark. Why the difference in the makeup
Right.
of the public
Great
equity
question.
benchmark that you're adding the 300 to versus our global equity benchmark?
Yep.
Why not keep those the
Fantastic
same?
question. Thank you, Alan. So the reason that those two things are different, so if you looked at the global public equity benchmark, it's closer to 50-50 U.S., non-U.S. And here we're talking 80-20, so why the disconnect? The difference is that when you look out there in constructing a well-diversified private equity program, it would be exceptionally rare to find one that's 50% non-U.S. There just aren't as rich opportunities out there for U.S.-based investors as there might be in the public markets, where it's very frictionless, low cost, et cetera, et cetera.
So it's the same basic index, it's just different weightings.
Different weightings to reflect what roughly the anticipated U.S., non-U.S. mix is over time.
Right, but the Russell 3 would be.
Well,
sort of
and the
common.
Russell 3 is going to pick up a little bit more of the small cap component as opposed to the U.S. piece of equity.
Right. But the base indexes are the same, just the weightings are different then, or the actual indexes themselves different?
Well, the index,
Yeah, go, please.
the index for the public equity allocation of
Yeah.
31% is the MSCI equity.
Right.
And then for the private equity piece, it's Russell 3000 and EFA.
Slightly different.
So that they are going to be slightly different. The weighting mechanism also, if you think about a function of where are we getting the opportunities at right now, what that allocation looks like, it's more tilted to the U.S., so it kind of made sense to do that. And also, with having the Russell 3000 there, you're picking up a little bit of the small cap flavor as well. But the U.S. component of the equity does not have the same exposure to small cap, so it's going to be a little bit more of a large cap bias. So that's why also for private equity, we want to get that small cap piece in there too.
Makes sense?
Mhm.
Yeah. The wonderful world of benchmarking.
Does
So,
it-
pardon
Does
me.
the mixture of our actual investments mirror the benchmark?
Well, is there a breakdown in here? I don't think it will at this point in
Not quite.
time. It's not going to be perfect.
You're right.
But ideally, when the benchmark was developed, it was based off the fact that there was, the vast majority of our assets for private equity were in U.S. markets.
Well, and with privates, I mean, it's never going to be, because not everything's investable by a long shot.
Right, right.
Absolutely not.
That's-
Yeah, and by the way, that is very common mix for big funds out there in terms of U.S., non-U.S. In your private equity component.
So- And I guess another question, so is this a benchmark y'all are using with all your plans? It's common, or is it sort of tweaked by plan, and sort of the nature of their program? I mean, when Hewitt is putting together a report?
Yeah. So there's two levels of benchmarks on private equity. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but I'll try to keep it big picture because this gets ugly fast. So private equity, of course, is not valued every quarter. These are things that take a long time to evolve. Sometimes there's losses in early years, and then you get all your return in the last years. What we think is the best metric for a successful private equity program is looking at their internal rates of return, and we've got some of those later in the report. However, you have a fund that needs to report on a quarterly basis. You get statements from your custodian, and we end up getting time-weighted returns like we do on every other asset class that need to be shown in a report. When we need to look at private equity against a time-weighted return, we like to use a stock index plus a threshold. The most commonly used out there right now is Russell 3000 plus 300. We've been moving our clients to incorporate non-U.S. into that benchmark between 20 and 30%, depending on how their program is structured. So the short answer to your question is, yes, that's our best thinking when we need to do it for time-weighted. What we think is the best practice to look at private equity is to not stop there, is to go on and look at it on an internal rate of return, to look at it versus other private equity funds that were raised in similar vintage years, and to look at the success of that. So as you dig into our private markets report, that separate, rather large document that we send to you every quarter, that has a great deal of detail on how not only the various components of your private markets are doing, but also the managers themselves. So that's what we think is the best way to look at it, but it's messy. It's not something that Bank of New York can easily look at every quarter. So it's something that you have to kind of look at over time. That makes sense. So I think what's important is private equity in its early years generally earns poor returns because you're taking down fees and you're not getting a lot of the resultant performance that comes out a lot of times in years 8, 9, 10 of a partnership. Keep in mind, this program's really only been around about 5 years, and you invested very heavily in secondary partnerships up front. That's really helped you tremendously, and so you've mitigated a lot of that early poor performance and are already producing some nice double-digit returns, so that's good to see. So I just want to take a minute on that, because you might look at the private equity program and think it's not doing well, and I would say that actually it's doing quite well. It's just more an issue of the short-term benchmark. Okay. So what we have here, and there's a lot of data on here, my apologies, it doesn't lend itself terribly well to a PowerPoint presentation, but hopefully you all have it in front of you on your slides. What we're trying to do here is to look at your risk and return profile versus other public funds. So this is the Bank of New York's universe of funds over $1 billion, public funds over $1 billion. And we're looking at how you fare in terms of total return, total risk in terms of volatility, and then Sharpe ratio. We looked at this last quarter, and when we looked at it last quarter, your Sharpe ratio was closer to about the median. This quarter, it's more like about the 74th percentile. So that's maybe something that's a little concerning. I would put forth that this is really a factor of your asset allocation, and that over the last 3 years and 5 years, we see that stock markets are really the driving force behind the highest total returns. So I think when we look at this, I always am a little hesitant to throw peer universes in front of folks for a couple of reasons. One, if we looked at different custodians' peer universes, you'd look different. If I looked at this next quarter, you're going to look different. These things are moving targets that you can't invest in. But it's always useful as fiduciaries to be looking at how you compare to others. But I would point out that most of the cause behind your relative rankings against other peers is an asset allocation choice over the last 5 years. And what we're looking at going forward is what's the right asset allocation for your liabilities going forward. We'll be looking at that again in February. We remain confident that where you are is the right place to be, both in terms of meeting your liabilities and doing this in the best interest of your beneficiaries. And we'll go over it again as we did last February with the Commission to affirm the asset allocation and see if there's any reason to be making changes. But we think this is the right asset allocation going forward that you've adopted.
Suzanne,
Sure.
Go ahead.
Did your peer grouping take into consideration the funding level of the plans?
No, and one of the things that's key about peer universe is all that you guys have in common is that you're public funds.
That's it.
And it's not necessarily of your size, it's not of your circumstances. You know, different funds have different structures to their liabilities, different rules for their assets,
Right.
Different oversight groups, and certainly different funded status. So there's folks in there that are over 100% funded, there's folks in there that are 30% funded. So it's a very wide range of circumstances. We think just looking at returns alone is very short-sighted because risk isn't taken into account, but we think it's important to look at risk as well. Other questions? So universes,
Suzanne,
oh, please.
What I was getting ready to say.
Yeah.
While you were talking, I was studying this, trying to figure out, make sure I understood it.
Yep.
I missed your bottom line summary of that particular chart. What's the bottom line?
So if you look at this, what we show is your, here, let me get the pointer out here, that'll help a little bit. So over here, we're showing a scatter diagram of all the funds in the BNY public fund universe over $1 billion. If you look at the square, I believe, that's your plan. This is the median here. Sorry, my hands aren't as steady as they could be. Right there at the crosshatch is the median. What we have here is your plan, and here's your policy. So on the axis here is standard deviation or volatility of returns, a form of risk, and this is return. So what we see is that your return is lower, but higher than your policy, lower than the average, but higher than your policy, and that your risk or volatility is somewhat lower as well against the average. Now, when we look over in here, what we're doing is trying to rank order them. So what's your ranking here in terms of percentile, 1 being the highest, 100 being the lowest. Here it is in terms of risk with, and forgive us here, we put 1 is generally considered good, so 1 here is lowest. So lowest volatility would be the highest ranked. So here you have a low volatility, so you have a relatively higher rank here. And then this is to try and neutralize the two, looking at your Sharpe ratio or return per unit of risk. And here you're at the 74th percentile, which is not something that you necessarily want to have going forward, but that's where we happen to be over the last 3 years.
And of course, that's also, as you say, in broad terms here, but we're also very low in the income.
In terms of
returns.
return?
And we've
Yes.
made some changes.
Yes.
Even in the PIVA audits, they speak of changing our asset allocation to have more asset-seeking returns.
Mhm.
So we are trying to make more.
Correct. Correct.
So when you say asset allocation is fine, you mean
Yeah,
in broad
we've made-
terms, but we need to make more money.
If we had a crystal ball and could have gone back over the last 5 years, this isn't necessarily the asset allocation one would have chosen in retrospect. At the time, I know there was reasoned debate, and we weren't on with you until the last year, but I know there were good reasons behind the asset allocation you had, and I think it's a very sensible asset allocation. What we did last year is we looked at your current asset liability circumstances with this group and a few new commissioners, so of course you hadn't had an opportunity to go through that yet, but we went through your asset liability circumstances, debated and discussed several different asset allocation opportunities, and decided that a slightly modified version of where you were was the best going forward, and so made those changes and moved forward. We'll look at that again in February, as is prudent to do every year, but we feel that you're in the right spot to meet your liabilities in a prudent way and not have a lot of volatility in the potential returns going forward.
Suzanne?
Yes.
Chairman Reynolds, of course, asked, basically what you said. Did you not also say that you weren't surprised as where we rated relative to the peer group based on the asset allocation we had?
Correct.
Okay, so.
Right. Yeah, I think it's, having equities was the place to be over the last 3 and 5 years. So the more heavy you were toward equities, and if you had nothing but equities, you would look fabulous on the return element of this.
And since we just really modified the asset allocation when you came on a year ago, this is trailing 3 years, 2 years of this is with the former asset allocation.
Sure, this
that
is
true?
history. This isn't,
Okay.
Perspective. So
So we're not really seeing 3 years of our new asset
absolutely
allocation.
not, yeah. And we've done that before. We've had, taken where you are and gone back and back, tested that and put that in there. It would look better, but it wouldn't be at number one, because that's not what we're trying to do, is to chase what's done well over the last 3 years, of
Well,
course.
and not just Chase, but I think going back 4 years ago, no one expected the Fed to buy $4 trillion
No.
worth of stuff, right? Right? Let's face it, you buy $4 trillion worth of stuff, this is what happens, right?
Right.
And so I'll be curious of our guests later, but as well as Hewitt, that is the big question.
Yep.
Right? Of what's the world look like, whether they, at 4 trillion, right, they have to buy $85 billion a month to keep it flat, right? So, the question is, do they taper? They can't taper if they want to keep the balance sheet the same size, right? What's the right allocation, knowing that the Fed is a primary determinant of where asset markets are, right?
Yes.
That's a wild card. No one expected them to do it, and then no one expected them to do it this long, right? And we're supposed to make a decision, right, when the biggest player in the market is creating a new PIMCO every 3 months, right? It's...
That's a good way to put it. I agree with you completely. If you, I won't go into our whole macroeconomic outlook, but I'll cut it down to the thumbnail, which is that we don't anticipate the traditional long-only stocks and bond markets to be to produce a very strong return over the next 3 to 5 years. That we're looking at, probably mid-single digits, maybe a high single digits at the most. But in the stock markets and the bond markets, I think we all see as being, flat at best. So where are you going to produce that return becomes the question. Do you take a lot of risk and up your equity exposure and take a lot of bets on how the U.S. market might do? We don't think that's smart. So our recommendation is to balance out equity and modest bond exposure with alternatives from a variety of different places, and to be smart about how you're using your active management. So we've been trying to convey that message with staff. I think it's very much in sync with where Herschel was going already when we first started talking a year ago, is to spend your active management points where managers have some latitude and where they can add value. So that's things like hedge funds, private equity, mixed credit. So I know it looks complex, from an asset allocation standpoint, but what we're trying to do, of course, is to balance out the various forms of risk so you're not dependent on the stock market continuing to be phenomenal. I mean, I would love to see that sort of return every year from the stock market. It just doesn't work that way, of course. And so we want to make sure that we're prepared when the opposite happens, and that we have a broad range of exposures, both in terms of market exposures and alpha exposures, to try and consistently produce a nice solid return for the system. I mean, that's, the concept we all discussed a year ago. And that's where we continue to believe the markets are heading.
And after lunch, we do have speakers to think about the credit markets, equity markets, and then to wrap it all up from a global macro perspective and think about some of those key risks that are out there. And to the can the Fed taper? The question is, are they out of bullets if you do get deflationary environment or another recession? What are they going to do there? Because now you go from thinking about the monetary to the fiscal, and are there other things that they can actually do? And then how do you control portfolio risk around a massive sell-off of all assets? And you remember the commission went back 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember, around that time period, and made that debt to equity shift of where we did take more credit risk. And the idea was that you get paid the equity-like returns for bond-like volatility, which we've seen that pay off, and that was the right trade. But with that said, the credit, as well as it's performed, it still lagged the stock market. With that said, you were much higher in the capital stack, so you did mitigate a significant amount of risk. And so it's those kind of trade-offs you have to think about when you structure that asset allocation of where do you want to be beyond volatility. So it's the actual risk of what happens if you have a default within a company or you have a significant recession. Can somebody pay back their debt? Do you want to be the equity or do you want to be the debt holder? And so we've made those decisions, had very good performance, yet it's going to trail when you have $4 trillion of assets bought and equity markets going up some 20% a year kind of clip. So, but we'll get into a lot more of the depth of, I think, some of those key risks and thinking about alternative ideas for the portfolio and asset allocation, which I think will be a great transition of kind of closing out this meeting and getting ideas on the table and thoughts ready for the February meeting for that asset allocation discussion too.
Right, and I'll just kind of preface my thinking on it, right, just as it relates to the Fed, right? I think the idea that they're going to shrink where they are is ludicrous, right? They can't, right? But I think everybody kind of worries about a world where either they keep inflating things up or they go away and everything goes down. But, I feel like in a lot of portfolios, there's a dearth of strategies that work if it just goes nowhere, right? Where you get into a very nominal sideways move, right? How are we going to extract income? There are ways to do it, but I think that's, markets can do 3 things, but I think everybody thinks about them going up or going down, not about them going sideways. So I just think within our allocations, looking at strategies that work when they go sideways, often gets overlooked.
Yeah, great.
There was a lot of talk about that before they started quantitative easing, about the sideways market. I think you spoke about it in this room, and then who knew, like you said, who knew? Are these charts going to ever reflect more than effectively volatility? Are we going to get into, do they ever have a component about, that reflects more accurately credit risk, all the other sorts of risk that mandatory in
The short answer is, I know staff is working on some modeling they're going to be doing. We have some tools that are going to be coming online when we convert over to our new system that'll give us some additional analytics that we can show you that will include some things like credit exposure and such. I just caution you that some of those models, it's very difficult to get at the real heart of it. So we'll work on that and make sure that it's something that's going to be useful to you. As an example, hedge funds incorporating all of their inputs into a total fund risk model can sometimes be challenging. So we want to make sure that we're doing it correctly and not just showing you what's coming out of the system. So the short answer is yes, coming, probably. Give it a couple quarters.
I think it's important.
Plan level, but I'm not sure you can do a peer.
Peers, no. Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's more plan, okay.
I was thinking more as the absolute, but good point.
Peers.
The peers, you're not going to get it.
Currency risk, all these things are
Right.
really ill-defined or undefined, and they're all significant risks, especially if the taper or the liftoff, as they start calling now, it happens.
And that's the difference between, this is completely hindsight, right? So 3 to 5 years, but you're more interested in where are we today and where are we going to be going if markets do X, Y, or Z. So that's certainly a form of modeling we do. I know that, as I said, staff is getting additional systems in that way too. I would say that's kind of the holy grail that really every public fund has been trying to up their game in the last year or two. It's always, we're trying to get more risk systems to try and forecast that accurately.
Suzanne, we've talked a lot about some arcane things that most of us sort of understand, the Sharpe ratio and all of that.
Yeah.
I think we give up a certain amount of return to buy a certain amount of reduction in
Yep.
risk. Over the last 3 years, based on this chart and everything else, did we pay a fair price?
Yeah, I think you did a pretty good job with it. You know, it's so hard because the stock market hasn't been reflecting as high a volatility as it has historically either. So it's not showing up as being a really high risk asset. But I think where you are is smart. I think where you've been has been smart. You've earned a strong return here. This is certainly not a return that is inappropriate for the asset allocation. It's a great return for the asset allocation, and helping you meet your liabilities. So,
But of course, it always go back for the asset allocation.
Right.
And you just said a few minutes ago that this is not the portfolio you would necessarily have created 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. But that's what every investor says.
that's not what I would. Let me restate
say?
that. Actually, I think the choices you made 5 years ago were smart ones. I think in hindsight, you wouldn't have created it. But yeah, I think it's actually a very well diversified portfolio, and I would have been supportive of it 5 years ago in terms of the overall asset allocation, because I think it was well structured. It didn't turn out to be as high performing as some other asset allocations that were chosen by public funds out there.
And I would have to add this, we think about asset allocation, it's not meant to be just pure return seeking.
I understand.
So I think that's a critical thing for us to think about, that it's really about what are the specific unique needs of the liability structure, and then what does that impact, if you will. And one of the things what I'm getting at is that if you have a much higher allocation to, say, equities and you experience the drawdown, then we're already at close to a 30-year amortization period. That's going to extend. And we know by the changes to the statute, that forces contribution rates up for employees and employers during a time when if the market's crashing, that tends to be not such great economic time, which means that tax receipts and so on and so forth are down. So those agencies themselves will have a more difficult time having to pay higher contribution rates and so on and so forth. So it's thinking about that total picture as it relates to, there may be a willingness to pay, but is there an ability to continue to pay higher contribution rates? And it's that whole linking of everything together. So we really want to be mindful of trying to get a 7.5% return when rates are basically zero. And I think some of the materials that we'll see a little bit later today will kind of bring all that back into perspective for us. And then we have to pay out, from a liquidity perspective, about 4% a year. So there's liquidity need. And we want to really avoid a significant drawdown. So it's really trying to balance all those things together. If you could eliminate that, well, you're much higher funded, you don't have nearly a 30-year amortization period, then I would say we probably would have more risk in the portfolio, more equities in the portfolio, because you've got a longer way to have a little bit more of a cushion there. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the theory is just fine. I think it's the way we try to do many things at the Treasurer's Office. What we sometimes come to blows here is the difference between theory and execution. And we know that we're moving a lot more toward passive management. We know that we're breaking up strategic partnerships because they were expensive, and we've got contracts we've renegotiated because we didn't have hurdles and high waters and things like that. So there are a lot of good things going on that ought to be celebrated, and they're all going to help us make more money.
Yeah, the strategic partnerships we're divesting from weren't necessarily based on a cost or an expense perspective. It was based much more on, do we need to continue to have that wrapper for that partnership if we're allocating to their next fund? And those are the ones that we have drawn down, because we'll just bring those fund investments back to the commission. So that's the rationale behind those partnerships that were being closed.
So the expense of the partnership, the wrapper itself, I mean, that's what we're talking about. You don't need the wrapper to invest.
That's, if you're getting co-investment opportunities, having a mechanism to close those in is very critical. Otherwise, you have no place to close a co-investment in. And we know that many of the co-investments are at very, very low fees, and some of them are actually at zero fee and zero carry.
Yeah.
Many of them are.
But, I mean, the strategic partnership is far greater than that. I mean, the strategic partnership is how many billions of dollars that are funds of funds, hedge of funds, all these things, and our amount of co-investments. What's a small percentage of that?
For the private equity-oriented managers, there is a significant chunk of co-investment in there. That program was suspended as the prior CIO left and departed, and we began to rebuild the team. Now, the co-investments, we're actually looking at more now today.
Good. And I agree with all of them.
Okay, Suzanne, unless you got anything else?
Yeah,
A little behind schedule.
really just the 5-year, it's a similar picture, and the one thing I did want to close on was private markets portfolio performance. We talked just simply because this is how we think you should be looking at the success of a private equity program. Again, there's a lot of data here, so my apologies for trying to get your arms around all of it. But what we've done here is looked at the 3 major components of your private market investments, and those are mostly illiquid, relatively illiquid investments, private debt, private equity, and real estate. And I talked about internal rates of return as being really the metric that we would suggest looking at. We have more detail within our private markets report that details vintage year performance, individual manager performance. Overall, we think it's a very, very strong program across the board. So you can see your internal rates of return since inception here are for private debt and private equity in excess of 11.5%. So very happy with that. And then real estate, as one would expect, is a more modest return in the more 7.3% IRR. But overall, in excess of 11% for your private markets.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is it time for the Russell?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. We have Greg Norquist from Russell. And I'm not sure if Jeff, there he is. Get there.
We're going to handle
You want to go ahead and do the introductions for us?
I'm not going to walk all the way up there, just seems like that's almost impossible to get there. As many of you know in the room here today, we currently deploy a lot of synthetic exposures to give our plan for market exposures in different asset classes that we are expected to have on an ongoing basis. In order to do this, we work with Russell Investments. In recent commission meetings, it's become clear to Herschel and I that we would all benefit from a refresher. Who is Russell? What are they doing? What's happened? A little bit of the history of this relationship. And Greg Norquist is here today. He's agreed to do this for us. Greg's here all the way from Seattle. I guess that makes it the largest commitment to get here. Greg's the Director of Overlay Services for Russell Implementation Services. He and his team manage custom overlays for large institutional investors, that folks like us. Greg joined Russell in 1990. I didn't know that until I got his bio, so I now have a sense of how old he is. He is a CFA charter holder, and I'm going to let Greg take it from here.
Thanks, Jeff. Let's see here. First of all, again, thank everybody for having us here, and understand it's a unique assignment that we have, and I think it's good for us to come and explain it once in a while. Probably last time was maybe 2010 at WAMP. And so, again, appreciate the opportunity just to kind of give the update and take questions. I'm going to give a little bit of overview in terms of who Russell is. I'm going to be mindful of time here and try and go quickly, but obviously if you have questions, fire away. Detail the mandate that we have with State of South Carolina that started in 2007, and have some operational-oriented discussion points that I can consolidate very easily. There's a lot of material here, like I mentioned. So let's dive right in here. First of all, Russell Investments, if you probably heard of us through our indexes, but we're an investment consultant is where our heritage lies. We've been a consultant for over 40 years to primarily corporate funds rather than publics, just kind of how our business evolved. But as we were giving that advice to large funds, we recognize that there's a need at smaller funds, and so we built a global asset management firm that manages today almost $250 billion in assets, and really kind of in the same shoes as yourselves, managing the liquidity, managing the managers, trying to figure out how to best maximize return and minimize costs. And that particular challenge has led us to become kind of a third subset here, which is implementation capabilities, learning how to move portfolios and manage liquidity and just overall improve the efficiency of the portfolio. As you know, what I view as we've become an industry leader in exposure management and implementation. So that's really what I'm going to focus on next. So Russell Implementation Services is really kind of three core capabilities. I'm not going to put an org chart up here, but we have over 100 associates that work primarily in Seattle, but also around the globe, working with clients globally. And of these competencies that we've developed in implementation space, there's really three pieces. The first is in terms of asset management, what I'll call more physical, stock trading, bond trading, which primarily consists of transition management that you've probably heard of, and obviously we've worked quite closely with your staff in this area. That's a capability that Russell's been, I think, an industry leader for as it's evolved into a very large industry, banks and asset managers and everything else. Russell has a unique business model that I'll talk about that we think really adds value to the program. The next line is interim portfolio management. This one that David mentioned earlier is something that sometimes you have what I'll call a between manager situation where you want to get rid of an existing manager, maybe don't have a replacement in mind, and so we work with staff and figure out exactly how to take down the active bets of the portfolio, build it into a tolerable risk and return expectation, and then we manage that ongoing and report to as an existing investment manager. So that's primarily the touch points on the physical side. Exposure management is really where our relationship started in 2007, and really the core of what we do is primarily derivatives based, where we are looking at your whole portfolio and your objectives in terms of where you want your asset allocation and helping you complete that as efficiently as possible. We use a term, whether it's cash equitization or rebalancing, just the overlay, is we want to replace your unintended risks, which is basically cash, with intended risk, which is the asset allocation that you have adopted. We want to help you minimize any slippage related to not being there that comes from liquidity management, from market movements. We've also delved into what I'll call some quasi-active space, enabling tactical rebalancing, as well as using options-based downside protection strategies. Now, all of this doesn't do a lot without a world-class trading capability, and that's something else that we've built up from the ground up in order to support this. And we call that slice of the pie execution management. We trade, as you'll note on the orange line, multi-venue pure agency. What the heck does that mean? Well, multi-venue is global access to liquidity that we've structured. And pure agency, I think, is one of the key points that everybody needs to walk away from here is we are an investment manager, and we are always acting on your side of the table, okay? So we don't take fees out of the trades. We're going out and accessing Wall Street in different packages, and we are not compensated in any way in the trading itself, okay? So that's different than other principal books and hiring a broker-dealer to do a trade. They're going to be invested in making money on the trade itself. So, and that's whether it's equity, fixed income, foreign exchange, or derivatives. And the foreign exchange element, I think, is a good one to highlight kind of the fundamental Russell philosophy. We've had an internal FX desk for about 10 years now. It was ahead of its time in terms of being an agent. It's a principal market. And over the last 5 or 6 years, you've heard a lot of press on unfortunate executions, if you will, in foreign exchange. Very costly to transact in the most liquid market in the world. We saw that in our own funds, as I mentioned, and built the agency desk in order to get our execution cost from 10 to 20 basis points down to about a half a basis point when we trade in forex on your behalf and on behalf of all our clients. So those are the core competencies of Russell Implementation Services, again, of which exposure management is the core of what we do for you. I'll accelerate a bit now here. I won't go through all the slides either, but just again, letting you know that this, our overlay services business, our exposure management business, is a global capability. Got 70-plus clients representing $400 billion in assets, so large clients just like you are what make up our client base. We trade a variety of instruments, futures, currency forwards, swaps, options on the global exchanges. And we've got a team of 25 people that is portfolio managers and analysts who are working on behalf of our clients. And we also have that round-the-clock trading capability that's a 20-member team specialized by asset class, by instrument, that are all working behind the scenes on your behalf. So let's move forward to page 10. What exactly do we describe our mandate with you? As I mentioned before, a plan-level exposure manager, beta exposure manager. This is actually a slide I stole from our 2007 finals presentation, which a couple of commissioners were at. But you had a very large transition of evolution of your portfolio. You were 50-50, U.S. stocks and U.S. bonds. And if you look at the pie chart that Suzanne put up a few minutes ago, I had a similar one and lost in condensation here, but think of a pie that's half and half, no diversification, and in the last 6+ years have moved to something where your largest single investment is about 12% of the portfolio. So it was very concentrated. What we were tasked with and what we presented this solution is to help you figure out how to best implement that change, where there's a million moving parts, there's tons of liquidity needs, there's managers hired and fired. You had, at the time, a relatively small staff who was trying to negotiate those contracts and make things happen, and we were really brought on as an extension of staff to help make that happen, help think through the instruments, whether it be physicals or futures or swaps, and really be kind of the strategic implementation advisor to, maybe a complement to the existing consultant relationship as the pure strategic advisor. So over the course of time, we've been acting in that role as we call beta management, where we're helping you manage not only the big transition, but also the nuances of just overall cash flow. Several hundreds of millions of dollars going through the portfolio in and out, and contributions and benefit payments and capital calls. And then, again, just replicating the intended bets of the portfolio, putting the market return in place of cash, which, we talk about the need to have a 7.5% return with cash earning next to zero. That's not a very good place to start. So you don't have that in your policy. We're just removing that and replacing it with existing capital market returns. At the start, we were what I'll call rules-based. We had passive asset allocation that we were trading to based on rules. Over the last several years, we've moved into what we call directed trading. So we don't trade on our own behalf. We consult with staff, and staff will call us up and say, okay, we'd like to fix this, and not just call us up, but as Jeff will know, we're fairly stickler for process, but documenting each of the trades. But really implementing it on a little bit slower twitch, just making more major shifts, but again, still trying to replicate the portfolio. And in September, we just got the portfolio shifted from the old definition of asset classes to the new definition of asset classes. So we've been working very hard behind the scenes to reflect the current portfolio needs. So since inception, again, May 07 was the inception. What I'm showing here is a little bit different return stream than David showed, and that typically gets shown. Is the problem with an overlay is it's not fully funded. So when you look at a return of the portfolio itself, it appears, quote, it doesn't have as much cash, so it appears levered. It magnifies the return. The cash is all there. It's never levered, but we go ahead and produce returns that are contribution to the total fund return. So we measure our overlay return in terms of the total fund. And so started off, I guess, slowly with a small contribution in '07. In '08, probably the one that probably needs to be discussed a little bit, because that's a little bit of a, I don't want that to be the elephant in the room, but since that time, obviously a very strong return, strong contribution return. So why are we down 15% in 2008? Well, we all know what happened, but just to put some context to this is, again, you started with no international exposure as a portfolio in '07. By the time '08 hit, and actually from day one, we had about 18% of the portfolio in international equity. We were helping you gain that diversification that could have been done a few ways. One of them would be to fund up the managers, and you're going to fund a global equity manager passively fairly shortly. But as a transition to that more diversified portfolio, we were managing a lot of that equity exposure. And the markets went down. You all know the story there, but we weren't making decisions on how much to hold. We were just effectively realizing the same loss had you funded a physical portfolio. So I guess to a certain extent that is the source of the negative. We do put ourselves up against a benchmark, and it's a little bit difficult to benchmark us because we have multiple assets. As David showed you, we've got commodities, we've got EM debt, we got everything. So what we measure ourselves against is what we call a perfect implementation benchmark that says if you would have bought the indexes that we're representing and matched them perfectly with no cost, what would my performance have been? And so for the last year to date, it would have been 1.8. We're at 1.7. In 2008, it would have been minus 14.9. It was minus 15.1. So we very tightly tracked the mandate and the exposures that were supposed to have been put on, or that were desired to have been on. Any questions before I move on? Okay. This is where it probably gets a little more tedious than you may want, and I guess I'll look to Chairman Williams. Would you like me to give me a time frame for how much longer you'd like?
If you got incredibly as tedious as you could possibly get, how much time would you ask?
It's probably 20 minutes to go through this.
I'll give you 10.
Give me 10. All right. Well, we're going to go very, very quickly, and I'm going to skip that one. If people have looked through the slides in advance and have questions on them, I'm happy to come back to them. But I just want to kind of highlight the roles that we play, and at the heart of what I mentioned is the investment performance is key to the outcome, right? That's what everybody cares about. That's what we're trying to achieve for you. But behind the scenes and in our overall capabilities, there's a heck of a lot going on, and I just want to highlight that. As I mentioned at the top, we kind of have a little bit of a cycle here, if you will, with the working with staff in terms of being a strategic advisor, and Jeff, if we had counted on the number of times that we've all been on the phone trying to figure out how to do what's next, we implemented a quarter of it maybe, but just over and over, being that kind of voice of thinking about how to achieve the returns that you want. We've spent countless hours in research, and I think it's a very valuable aspect. In addition to that, reporting. In exchange to make things operate, as I mentioned, the direction of what exposures need to put on needs to come from you. That's something that, again, we're a taker of. Once we get that, though, we've built out, as I mentioned, a global trading capability. This also involves counterparty management in terms of we've negotiated ISDAs on your behalf with 12 counterparties that we work to manage. We manage the research of those counterparties, the collateralization, very, very detailed processes behind the scene. Trade execution and collateral management, working with the brokers, and then working on the settlements and working with the trustees, reporting everything back to you in terms of performance as well as holdings and very detailed components. I mentioned before we have a global trading platform that we've established in Seattle. This is a fairly busy chart, and I'm just going to focus you on the words that this describes, rather. We're round-the-clock trading out of Seattle. That's something we think is very important, to be traders on the desk while we're trading globally for you. We're trading with Tokyo, with Australia, with London. It's inconvenient to have to work what we call the Asia shift, but that's where we manage the executions and really make sure that we're doing as good as we can. We're specialized by both region, by asset class, and by instrument. And a key risk management aspect I want to mention is separation of duties. Our portfolio managers who instruct the trades are different than the traders who complete them. And the point of that is, if we're thinking about from an operational aspect, when derivatives can be something that's, I guess, gets a bad rap, and most of the time they get a bad rap is from lack of separation of duties and lack of oversight, and these are things that we've built, painstakingly, I guess I say, in our processes, in terms of making sure that we're on top of everything from a process and procedure. Very quickly, as I mentioned before, when it comes to physical trading, we are quite unique, and I'm not going to, again, take you through the details here, but the key points on this are that we are both an investment advisor, so we're registered as an investment advisor, so we can contract an investment manager. We're also duly registered as a broker. And again, that doesn't mean we're putting our own firm principal at risk. That's absolutely far from the truth. But being this player with that registration allows us to see other dealer flow, because we're not a party to the trade. We're not going to go out and try and pick them off if they show us stuff. So we see a lot of one-way inbound indication of where the markets are, and that's very beneficial to sourcing liquidity and getting great executions. And on the next page, we kind of highlight this in terms of our execution as measured by a third party. We rank very highly in the Elkins McSherry universe, which we show as a plus 18 basis point improvement. They study all of our transition activity, all of our trading activity. I didn't mention it earlier, but I think it does bear stating. As I mentioned, we're large. In 2012, we traded almost $1.5 trillion across our derivatives portfolios and our physical portfolios, and I expect that to be probably broken this year again. So we're definitely a very large player in the markets. How am I doing? Take you through a life of a trade, or skip that?
Well, if I can chime in on this, this is something the audit committee spent a fair bit of time, and Jeff did a good job with the audit committee, kind of looking at it, because it's an important issue that we thought was worth kind of getting looked at, particularly in light of email generally not being viewed any longer as a secure medium. So Jeff did a good job presenting this. Audit committee's looked at it, so certainly I think it's worth going through.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned in the initial stages, we were rules-based, which means the allocation that you gave us had rules around how far you could drift, and we were correcting things, obviously with a lot of interaction still, but we call it on autopilot. When we're in directed mode, we have to have a way to both get your trading needs in order to execute them, and still protect things, because you don't sit with our systems on your desk where you can enter them. So what we, again, I'll try and go fairly quickly here, but this is an example of an email from Jeff to Brian Causey, one of our lead portfolio managers, saying, yep, we got it. Now we have embedded within this is a template that says we'd like to be a buyer of $118.8 million in MSCI EFA basket, so our futures basket. Trade date 10/31, and order type best efforts. So just a market order, go out and execute that. So when that happens, we move to go into our system and take that instruction and say, okay, we have $118.8 million of international equity futures basket. Our system then goes ahead and produces a list of the futures contracts that make it up. I can't see from this angle. That's terrible. Never mind. There's a bunch of futures contracts there, best efforts order type. And what happens in this case is the lead portfolio manager, as I mentioned, Brian Kazi, will have a second portfolio manager, myself, John Bailey, whoever it is, be the proof to this that says, okay, yes, this is what the client instructed, this is the right amounts, the right direction. Again, because this is a bit of a manual process at the origin that our system needs to be validated. That then goes off to our trading desk, and importantly, we note at the bottom that when this gets loaded automatically in the trader's blotter, we're still going to take a few more minutes, walk over and talk to them, particularly if it's a big trade. This one, I'd say, is pretty small, but always when there's complexity, we want to make sure that we've detailed what the trading strategy is, what the timing of it is, just any nuances. And then the traders will go out and I won't take you through that part of the process. They fill it and they say, okay, import it back into our systems, as well as once they've confirmed with the broker, they'll SWIFT those messages out to the custodian, so electronic communication to the custodian, and so all parties know what's happened behind the scenes. And we take a look at it as it comes back in our systems and say, yep, we got all these to within, basically residuals from market movements that happened over the course of time. So it's all, as much as it can be, systematized, as I mentioned, outside of that starting point. Got counterparty risk, and then I'm done. Okay? So managing counterparty risk, another piece that's topical, if you will. We tackle it in three ways. The first is managing the credit quality of the counterparties that we deal with. We have an independent research team that's out there reviewing the credits, reviewing the updates on what's happening in the market, and dealing with only the top tier that we can. The next approach is to not just have one counterparty, but to deal with a diversified pool. So your exposures across 10 counterparties gives you that diversification. And then probably the most important part of this is collateralizing unrealized gains and losses. Now, if we could have it one way, we'd say, well, we just want to collateralize the gains, but the counterparties don't necessarily like that. So we're going to collateralize gains and losses, and as I walk back through the relationship, this is something that we did before the financial crisis. It wasn't that popular across a lot of, the marketplace was not big into collateralizing. Now it is the norm, and you really cannot interact with Wall Street without dual collateralization. And just one interesting, I'll skip that. Any questions? All right. Well, that's just a quick summary of why Russell. I mentioned a lot of it, but that alignment of interests and acting as an investment advisor, I think, is very important. The fees that we charge for this are low, fair, but we are a cheap beta overlay manager for you on a fund that has a lot of exposure there. We bring a very experienced team that I think is second to none in the industry, and obviously a research-based investment approach and implementation capabilities that are world-class and second to none.
Yeah, do have some questions. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We used to get these wonderful charts, Russell overlay.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to get those again?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we provide monthly.
Oh, you provide these? So is it, okay, this is actually new. I'm sorry.
Sure.
This is a
Post
while
them to
back.
the commissioner site if you'd like.
Yeah, these are very helpful. Thank you very much. Couple questions. On the rebalancing that y'all do kind of on a regular basis, I know you went to a big one recently because of the change in the asset allocation. Is that a rules-based, or do you get a call or an email about that?
No, this is, again, nothing we're doing right now is rules-based. It is all working with staff and evaluating where we are. And
I think the rules-based stopped mid-late '09.
Early '09.
Early '09, okay.
Yeah. So.
To be clear, there has not been a lot of activity since the asset allocation change in the overlay. It's been primarily through withdrawing capital and moving actual capital around as opposed to the synthetic exposure we have there. There have been a few relatively minor exposure shifts in the overlay, but There really has not been a whole lot, so just to be.
Yeah,
clear.
and, I mean, maybe we can provide, Reynolds and myself haven't been here the entire time. When this was initially set up, it was very rules-based, and it was done monthly to the T, right? But we were basically posting collateral, and that's when the securities lending thing happened, and all of a sudden, we're trying to get back what we had been told were Ginnie Mae's, and they were not, in fact, Ginnie Mae's. We started going, for lack of a better term, off script, kind of early '09, and giving staff more discretion to work with Russell, because the collateral postings, I mean, you were probably there much closer, but the variation margins on a daily basis were extreme. Would that be fair?
It was an extreme environment, for sure.
Right. So we sort of, free-formed it, so it wasn't a monthly to the T rebalance, whereas when the Russell program originally started, it was, every month they brought it, back to policy, and, as we were shifting in a very mechanical way, but, between the securities lending issue and the volatility, in the market, we, loosened that.
Greg, can you go back to that where you had the settlement piece of it? There was a table right there.
Yeah.
And I think that's, Greg kind of mentioned something there that now this has become more standard, but early on, what happened is the swaps began to function almost effectively like a futures contract at a clearing court because of having such tight parameters on the collateral control for gains or losses. So that's why during the sell-off in the financial crisis, you're constantly, as Mr. Gillespie was saying, raising capital as markets were falling real long, so we're having to pay. We're constantly raising capital because of these negotiated agreements. So for us, at that point in time, you go, ouch, that hurts. But the flip side would be, well, what if somebody owes you money? And usually when you're going to be owed money, you want to make sure you're collecting it, putting it there. So it's a give or take there, but this was actually a good call on the commission's part early on. So.
And actually, just to tie in what you mentioned, one thing that skipped on earlier that I will now mention, because of the cash needs that happened during that time, we worked with staff and Morgan Stanley to accept a very unusual piece of collateral to limit the cash drawdown, which was the Strategic Partnership Fund that you had invested in, and we negotiated a side letter with them to basically then go into one-way posting of collateral. When you owed them, they looked at the fund. When they owed you, they posted cash. So that was a unique evolution.
Your charts were calendar year, and we'd asked, I don't know if you were driving yesterday, if we get those fiscal year, just so we match ours. And then, I hate to even ask you to do this, but you did for me last night. Can you talk a little bit about pricing and fair value and how you get there?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of a unique discussion here, but I'll try and do my best without any charts.
And just in broad terms, I mean, we're not going to...
So, I mean, the S&P 500 contracts are probably the best one to describe, and first of all, most of the markets are very interchangeable, right? If you have $100, you could buy $100 worth of S&P ETF, you could buy S&P index fund, you could buy that contract representing, a futures contract representing S&P 500 performance, and then you hold back the cash, and you have to invest the cash, post collateral, etc. The combined return of the future plus the cash is going to very closely match the return of the index fund. If it gets too far out of whack, brokers will come in on either side of it. And so this notion of fair value is how close does the value of that contract tie to the underlying index. And it tends to be within 15, 20 basis points of what you'd consider absolute fair value. Without going more into the weeds, is that good?
That's weedy enough.
Weedy enough, okay. Any other questions?
Are there any more questions?
Could I just add to, in response to Mr. Loftus' question? Two questions, actually. One, you mentioned just a recent rebalancing activity. What you saw in, I think, a change in the reports, probably in September, if I recall, is more of a recategorization by Russell to align with our actual policy classes, not so much actual rebalance trading, if you will. So there's two things there. We made changes to the policy definitions, policy classes, and in the simplification directive that we've been working through, part of that was to stop the Portable Alpha program. Both of those things were reflected previously in the Russell reports. So what you saw was just a simplification, if you will, of the reports, not necessarily a bulge in activity, if you will. So I just want to make sure that was part clear. The other answer to your question on pricing is in the ISDA contracts themselves, with respect to the reference price on the reference index. It's usually defined that it will be a public market reference, and there will be a hierarchy of if this does not exist, then you move to this one as a reference point. And so that is always included by specific reference in those contracts. So that's a different answer, a different perspective than what Greg provided, but that's also a true statement to your question.
Is there a rule of thumb, just if you're sitting at your desk without a calculator, the difference between that value and the nominal value?
Difference between that value and the notional value?
Notional value, I'm sorry.
No, the notional value is, as I mentioned, that $100, if you will, or that $6 billion, is the notional value of the contracts. And that fair value would just be noise on top of that, whether it's slightly different or not.
So what we do is, if you think about $6 billion of notional, how do you fully collateralize, if you will, that $6 billion? Well, do you take $6 billion and move it out of the trust and put it into this collateral account to back this up, when the requirements are somewhere, we just say roughly 15%? So how we approach that is we would maintain the 85% in the trust itself, if you will. And then the 15% is where, it's all still within the trust, but it's a separate account that's used for that, basically posting a margin against that notional. So back in September, I think, when I was in your offices with Derry, and we were talking about that return, and I think on the Bank of New York report, it's a big difference. Well, that's where you get that notional, the return on the notional versus the equity that's in there, or that piece of margin, and that's that levered return that was showing up on the Bank of New York's report. If you take that and you say, well, no, you've got the other collateral here, and you put it all together, then that return looks much more like the actual index, say, in this case, an S&P 500 index. So that's where some of those differences will come up on.
And just to kind of cement that, in the appendix, there's a chart kind of showing the full exposure. And basically, think about our account is this. It's collateral that's required, a little bit of margin to pay those daily variances, and then the cash and equivalents that lives elsewhere in the fund is the cash and the short-term investments that are in separate accounts.
Okay, I think it's time to hear a motion to go into executive session to receive legal advice, discuss personnel matters, and discuss investment matters pursuant to the 2 code sections cited on the agenda. Do I hear such a motion?
I'll make that motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. Ayes have it. For those of you in the room and elsewhere, a little bit of planning purposes, we anticipate the executive session will take approximately an hour. There's one matter that comes up in open session right after the executive session, and then we'll adjourn for lunch. We'll be back in open session for the rest of the day, starting at roughly 1 o'clock, and I hope promptly at 1 o'clock. Thank you. Do I have unanimous consent for the Travis Pritchett resolution? Yes. Okay, so done. The only other thing I wanted to remind everyone that the evaluations of our Chief Investment Officer, you received the information about a week ago. You're supposed to have it back to me within 2 weeks.
Was that supposed to come as a packet, or?
It's by email. I got mine by email.
Who would it come from?
Sarah. Oh, no, Betsy, I think.
I sent it out earlier this week.
Yeah, no.
Herschel, came from Herschel.
Herschel.
All right, I'll look for it, I've been on the road.
Just in case, Herschel, don't you resend it? I know several of us have turned them in, some of us haven't, so. Anyway,
we'll go through the formal evaluation process at the next meeting, since the 2-week period will have run. Only other thing I have given, or will be giving, Nancy the pending questions that I see as open issues. Rather than reading them out now, let me just ask you, anybody who wants to add to them or subtract from them to, well, I can read them. First one is is the goal position wrapped up into the commodities index overlay. I don't know if that's an accurate summary, but at least it's a reminder of that issue that Commissioner Gillespie raised. And the other pending issues, the report on the investment manager gifts, and the third pending issue is get the CIO evaluations turned in. Do I hear a motion that we adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. No opposed. We adjourn. Good meeting. Thanks, everybody.